Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here. Well, unfortunately, I guess the good part of not having to travel is you don't have to get on a plane, and the bad part is I don't get to be in Montreal and hang out with people. But it's nice to be back. So I'm going to talk about machine learning for neuroimaging. Why, as you can see, the why is not actually. I assume that you're all here because you think there's something important about machine learning as applied neuroimaging. But talking about the motivation, I think, is a kind of a good cover story for actually exploring some of the core ideas and concepts. And so, ostensibly, this is a talk motivating why you should want to do machine learning neuroimaging. But along the way, I'll introduce really some high-level concepts, and I think the presentations after this will get into sort of more hands-on nuts and bolts. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A at any point. I'll try to keep an eye out on those, and I will answer them if I can. So let's start with really sort of what machine learning is. I'm not sure if you've already covered that in this course so far. I won't actually give you one definition. I'll give you sort of two definitions or two ways of thinking about what machine learning is. One is, and this is really sort of the more accurate way to talk about machine learning. It's a field, right? It's a large field. It's a huge field focused on algorithmically learning information from data. So it's really about teaching machines to do things that we value. And I think if you asked a machine learning practitioner what they do, they would give you something that sounds vaguely like this definition. But if you're a neuroimaging researcher or a psychologist, that's, I would say, actually probably not the most salient definition of machine learning. And it might be better to think of machine learning actually as a philosophy, which sounds a little weird, but I will unpack that. So the idea is that instead of thinking of it as sort of, if you're doing a PhD in neuroscience, sure, you might learn a little machine learning, but you're probably not going to develop the same background as someone who's spending the last 5 years studying machine learning. What would you benefit from by learning just a little bit about machine learning? And I think the answer is it gives you an instrumental way of thinking about the modeling enterprise, right? So thinking like machine learning researchers, I think, can help us do better or at least different kind of scientific work in neuroscience and psychology and really many other fields. And this way of thinking contrasts markedly with the traditional view in most sciences. And so much so that people sometimes describe these as two different cultures. So there's this idea that goes back to Leo Breiman in 2001, a very influential paper called The Two Cultures. And he was talking about statistics, but the same actually applies, I think, to science, to many sciences, including neuroimaging and psychology. And the idea is that there are really two ways to think about modeling and science broadly. One is sort of the explanatory tradition where you're trying to understand how the world works, right? So your goal is really to understand the system that you're interested in. How does it actually work in the organism, in our case humans probably, that you're interested in understanding cognition. But there's another way of thinking about things, which is to say, look, it doesn't matter to me that much what really is truly going on inside the human skull. My goal is to intervene on the world in support of some practical goal. So I want to do useful things in the world. And it's less important if I sort of quote unquote understand what's going on inside that black box that is the human skull. So roughly you can say that these are objectives of explaining versus predicting. And scientists traditionally pursue the former predominantly, whereas machine learning is largely focused on the latter. Right? And so just very schematically, you can think of it this way. If you are doing sort of explanatory modeling in psychology or neuroscience, then you are probably interested in these gears, right? So there's some input to like an experimental task, let's say, and then something happens inside your skull, and then out comes some response. But you really want to know what it is that's happening here, right? It's not a black box. You actually want to understand these cogs or something about them at some level of analysis that you like. Whereas if you're doing prediction, you might not care at all, right? So your goal is to pass in some input, get some output, and learn some approximating function. So you're doing function approximation, right? You know that there is, of course, some mechanism in the human brain that does some work and produces responses, that produces language, that can dance if you ask it to dance, that can play, basketball and all kinds of things. But you're not so interested in exactly what that process is, as long as you can learn some approximating function that, given similar inputs, produces similar outputs. Right? That's good enough for predicting and intervening on the real world. So that's sort of the schematic, almost caricature of the contrast between these things. Now, typically when you present it this way, people will look at it and say, well, this is kind of silly, right? Like, why do you have to choose? Like, why can't you have both understanding and prediction? You might even think that there's a question with the slides available. Yeah, sure. I'll make sure that the slides are available later. There's a question, doesn't good explanation entail good prediction? Right? Like, if you had the right, like if you fully understood what's going on inside the skull, wouldn't that imply necessarily that you can generate like almost perfect predictions? And the answer is, in principle, yes. So if you did know everything about like what every neuron was doing, how it's connected to every other neuron, et cetera, then in principle, if you had like essentially unlimited compute, yes, you could produce perfect predictions. But in practice, of course, you don't have that. You don't have the ability to like understand the schematic diagram all the way down. And if you did, you wouldn't have the computing power to actually like run the forward pass of that model and generate predictions. So in practice, these things are usually in tension, and it just works out that normally, not saying it's necessarily true, but normally you have to choose between them to some degree. You usually have a choice between like a model that generates better predictions, but maybe is not as easy to understand, or might be a black box, and one that is maybe sort of feels explanatory, but maybe you can't do something quite as useful with it. There's a question, does good prediction translate to good explanation? Not in general. I mean, so again, like, I mean, there's clearly a relationship, right? I mean, like, if a model is very good at predicting human behavior, it must be capturing something about or at least approximating what's going on, right? And so there's a sense in which if you had a really good predictive model, probably it's doing something, vaguely at least, like what goes on in the human brain. But it doesn't have to be something you can easily understand, right? I mean, you might have, this is increasingly the way things are going, you might have deep learning models with like hundreds of Google just trained a 1 trillion parameter model for language. So that model probably does, I mean, it does language translation, for example, exceedingly well, but good luck understanding what's going on in those trillion parameters, right? And so the fact that the state-of-the-art predictive models seem to be very, very complex and look a lot like black boxes might lead you to think that maybe there's some tension there, right? That you can't have both. In principle, though, sure, like in principle, maybe what you can say is that if a model is really good at doing prediction, somewhere in that model is represented information that might, in theory, help you explain. But there's no guarantee that our puny little minds can actually understand. So that's, I think, something to be aware of. Okay, so there is that tension. I'm not saying it's necessarily true everywhere, but you should at the very least accept that you might not be able to have both, right? And there's no guarantee that just because you have a model that you like, that seems explanatory, it can make good predictions or vice versa. So with that in mind, why would you want to do machine learning in cognitive neuroscience or neuroimaging? And the rest of the talk really will just be sort of walking through a bunch of different rationales. And along the way, I'll introduce some sort of high-level concepts that hopefully are useful in understanding and thinking about machine learning. Let me just mark that. Okay. So I'll talk about prediction for the sake of itself, right? So you might just be interested in prediction. For example, if you're a clinician, maybe you just care about like solving real-world problems. You don't really care about why the solutions seem to work. You might want to increase sensitivity. So in certain kinds of analyses, machine learning will allow you to generate stronger results. There are certain concepts and practices that come out of machine learning that are very useful for keeping ourselves honest, even when we're doing conventional science. We might want to obtain useful low-dimensional descriptions by doing various forms of what's called unsupervised machine learning. And despite the fact that people call machine learning often a black box, it's not really. I mean, it's entirely a question of the particular method or algorithm you're using, whether or not it gives you some control over interpretability. And in fact, in some ways, machine learning gives you a much more principled way of understanding trade-offs between explanation and prediction. And lastly, there are actually some interesting scenarios, actually, I think in many cases, where you can use machine learning methods to help inform sort of more traditional theoretical questions. So I'll give examples of each of these, and again, feel free to ask questions as I go on. So let's talk a little bit about prediction for the sake of itself, right? I mean, I think it should sort of seem intuitive that many applications that people are trying to use neuroimaging data for are just inherently prediction focused. It's sort of in the nature of the beast that you care about the outcome predominantly. Brain-based biomarkers are an excellent example, right? I mean, almost by definition, the goal of trying to find brain-based biomarkers for depression, schizophrenia, et cetera, is to find something you can use to diagnose or predict trajectory of some syndrome. And you might care about what is going on mechanistically, but you don't have to, right? A clinician might not care at all. If they have some cheap and easy biomarker that they could use to say, oh, this person has this kind of schizophrenia and these treatments seem to work for them, it's not obvious they need to care at all why that works. Lie detection is another application you hear about from time to time, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if you were, let's say, an official in certain government agencies, wouldn't it be great if you could put people in an fMRI scanner or hook them up to some other technique, EEG or even a polygraph, right, the skin conductance, and determine whether they're lying, essentially read off their brain. And so, or even for research purposes, like where mind reading is sort of something you hear about a lot. The idea that you put someone in the scanner and scan their brain and then infer what they're looking at or thinking about, et cetera. And the idea in these applications is you might not, again, I'm not saying you don't have to, you shouldn't, but you don't need to care about the mechanism. You might just be happy with a good prediction that allows you to intervene on the world. And again, in such cases, we might be willing to give up on some or all of interpretability, potentially. Now, it turns out that conventional subtraction studies, even extremely well-done ones, can't really be used for, can't very easily be used for prediction. You might intuitively think that if you have some very well-developed large sample contrast between two conditions and you identify some brain activity pattern, that that intuitively should lend itself to being able to do something in the world with it. If you feel confident that you've identified some pattern, why wouldn't that be useful for prediction? But that gap is pretty large between typical sort of subtractive approaches and individual level predictions. I'll give you an example from the domain of pain. So there's been a lot of work, really nice work, going back now in that 15 years, studying the neural basis of pain. And it's been shown in individual studies and various meta-analyses like this one that there are lots of brain regions that we know are systematically involved in the perception of pain. So this is a whole brain image-based meta-analysis from Tom Nichols' group and other colleagues a few years ago now. I think this is like 9 or 10 studies. And you get these very consistently activated regions when people are perceiving pain as opposed to when they're not. And this is extremely reliable. Like, you're not going to find like different results if you do a pain study in 2020, right? I mean, like, we understand broadly at a high level what the neural correlates of pain are with fMRI at least. So you might say, well, great, we know that, so now we can go out and we can in the clinic determine whether someone is experiencing pain or not. But that's very, very unclear, right? Because, I mean, if you think about this, there's lots of problems translating this kind of level, this kind of pattern at the level of entire data sets or even groups to individual level predictions. Think about scaling. So I have this map here, and I have these nice bright blobs that say, yes, there's activation in this region on average when people are in pain. Okay, so now I bring someone to the clinic, I give them a brain scan, and I look at the values that come off the scanner. How do I relate these average values from a bunch of studies to this person, right? Like, how do I scale this result you're seeing in front of you to, oh, this person experienced this or showed this much activity in these regions, and so therefore they're at risk for this condition, right? There's a big gap there. And so arguably, if you want to make those kinds of predictions, you really have to frame the problem in a way that lends itself to those predictions. So you have to sort of think about it as a predictive problem from the very beginning. And so a different kind of approach is something like this. This is from Tor Rager's group, where I did my postdoc. And they work with pain a lot, but in a machine learning context. And so what you're seeing here is a nice example where they trained a model on several different pain studies. They've identified a pattern of activity across the brain, which you're seeing here in this panel A, that predicts individual ratings of pain within subjects. So as pain for a given individual increases, activity in the red and yellow regions increases, and conversely, you get negative effects in these blue regions, right? And this might look a lot like this. In fact, a lot of the regions overlap. But the difference is that these weights actually mean something in the situated context of individual ratings. And so they actually have a model, in this case, a purely linear model, I believe, that you can use to generate individual level predictions about how much subjective pain someone is going to report given their brain activity. And I'll talk about cross-validation in a little bit, but the point here is that you can actually use this model to generate reasonably accurate predictions, both within person, meaning if I know how your brain responds for, I don't know, 46 degrees temperature applied to your arm, which is painful, then I might be able to generate a pretty good prediction for what, how much pain you're in when I see a different amount of activity. Right? So I can say, oh, you're now experiencing 48 degree pain. And you will report maybe like a 7 out of 8 on the subjective rating scale. And you can also do the same thing across subjects. So you can use this model trained on some subjects and show that you can actually reasonably accurately predict pain reports in subjects who the model has not seen before. And that's much more, I think, it's a much more direct and useful predictive application than just saying, well, we understand the neural correlates of pain in a meta-analysis. And they also did some other nice things to show that this is sort of a fairly selective signature. It doesn't predict recall of pain or anticipation of pain. It seems fairly specific to the perception of physical heat-induced pain. So it's a different setup, a different way of thinking about it. And what you get for your trouble is actually a model that can predict concrete outcomes that you might care about, like how much pain is this person going to be in. And so you imagine applying this more broadly, then people think about, could you identify chronic pain populations, for example, or different kinds of pain based on brain data? Could you identify the likely trajectory of responses and outcomes if you prescribe different treatments? Right? You get into this world where you can start to ask very sort of actionable questions about what will happen if you do X, which is not so obvious if you're sort of just doing subtraction-based contrasts, et cetera. Sorry, there's a question. What are subtraction studies? Yeah, I should have just, all I'm talking about here is, and these are by no means the only studies people sort of traditionally do, but the idea is just that you have two conditions, right? So fMRI it's a relative measure of activity. You're always comparing two conditions or more. And so subtraction just means, let's say you have high pain versus low pain, right? So you're modeling how brain activity changes as you go from a lower level of pain to a higher level of pain. So you have some contrast between two or more conditions. And you contrast that with a kind of machine learning approach where, typically you still have these conditions as the input that you're training on, but you're not sort of just looking at the difference in some sense, right? You're actually doing sort of more interesting, more prediction-oriented things with the data than just quantifying the difference between the two and saying, oh, it's significant or something like that. Okay. Now, in the imaging world, the way people have come to talk about many, if not most, machine learning applications is in terms of what are called encoding and decoding. And so most predictive applications, you'll see it use one of these terms, or at least there's they're talking about either encoding or decoding or both. And this came up a little bit already. This is analogous to the notion of forward inference and reverse inference in classical inference. So I won't get into these ideas here, but if you've heard the terms and you've read a little bit about them, just know that when I say encoding, that's sort of analogous to forward inference, and decoding is analogous to reverse inference. I'll show you that this slide. So, and I should mention that I don't explicitly draw this out because I think you'll hear a lot more about it, but there's sort of a very high level distinction between sort of two main branches of machine learning: supervised and unsupervised. And most of this talk I'll talk about supervised learning, and supervised learning you can just read as like essentially, well, I don't want to say it's just regression, it's not, but anytime you know the answer, you're trying to predict, train a model where you in your training data, you already know the answer, you have labels that tell you what the correct answer is for each observation, you're doing supervised learning. So supervised because you sort of know the answer. You can imagine someone standing over your shoulder saying, that's correct, that's incorrect, et cetera. And so encoding and decoding applications can sometimes be built on unsupervised machine learning, but they are sort of supervised applications in the sense that you're asking how well your model does with respect to some answer that you know. So if that's not super clear, don't worry about it. I think you'll probably hear much more about supervised learning in a bit. the main distinction I want to draw here is between encoding and decoding. And so just very simplistically, imagine you have some space out in the real world. In this case, it's like face space, right? So you have some space of stimuli. This is one face, but there could be infinitely many different faces. And we're trying to understand, or at least, I shouldn't say trying to understand, and we know that the brain can process faces, right? We're able somehow to recognize faces and respond to them uniquely, et cetera. So you have the neural space here. And in between, you might have some intermediate feature space, which is to say, we think the brain is probably using some information about faces that can be represented in some intermediate space that's not just like a voxel by voxel, or pixel by pixel, I should say, image of each individual face. Maybe it's learning different features like, how close eyes are together, like the general structure of the skull, color of the hair, right? All these kinds of things that can help you at some level in the visual hierarchy identify who it is that you're looking at, or form an entirely new representation of someone you haven't seen before. And the idea here is that in thinking about the mapping between these things, how do you go from stimulus space to neural space or vice versa? We talk about encoding as being, or forward inference, as being moving in this direction from the world, essentially, into the brain. So to talk about encoding is to say, if you have some input image, like a face, how is the brain representing that, right? So give me a model that can essentially project that face into a neural representation so that I can make a prediction given a given face or a different, or a given sentence or a clip of a movie, anything at all, really. I can make a prediction about what brain activity should look like, right? So I'm encoding the stimulus into the neural space and making a prediction about what the brain would be doing. And decoding is just the inverse of that. It's just saying, if you give me some pattern of brain activity, then if I have a decoder model I've trained, it should be able to sort of make a prediction about what the thing is that I'm looking at or thinking about, right? So if you give me a neural pattern and I can decode that into face space, then I should be able to answer questions like, best case scenario, who is it that I'm looking at? But if that's too hard, at least, if there are 10 candidates, which of these people am I most likely to be looking at? Right? So that's decoding. Or reverse inference, so trying to infer from neural representation something about the thought processes that are happening, or what you're looking at, thinking, feeling, etc. So hopefully that distinction makes sense. There was a question here, are functional connectivity metrics generally better at predicting than structural MR metrics in pain? I'm actually not sure, not my area, so it's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that, sorry. But I'm sure there's probably a large literature on that. It's a good question, but I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. There's a question, so activation analysis would be equivalent to Feynman's data model. It's ish, maybe, right? To a first approximation. It's really about how you use the analysis and not so much the analysis itself. But I will say that if the way you think about sort of a contrast between two conditions is, I now understand something about what regions are involved in the brain, and you feel like there's some explanation there that you're understanding, or there's something mechanistic that you feel is helping you think about that, then that I would say is sort of is an explanatory modeling perspective. Whereas if you're saying, look, I don't really pretend to think I understand, what these regions are doing, it turns out that there's information here that when you feed into this model can generate a good prediction, and that's what I care about, then that would be sort of more of the data modeling perspective. Okay, so I'll just show you just an example of each of these approaches. This is a fairly well-known study now from Alex Huth and Jack Gallant's group a few years ago. And this is an example of encoding. So what they did here was they took people, put them in the scanner, and they had them listen to narratives, radio stories. And they trained a model that could generate predictions of brain activity, sort of time point by time point, given a encoding of the text. And so they use semantic embeddings, which I won't get into, but the idea is you just take the actual transcript, moment by moment text that people heard, and you obtain a fairly high dimensional, but still lower dimension than the original text, representation or an embedding of that semantic content. and then you train a model, a linear model in this case, to predict brain activity from those sort of underlying text features. And so once you do that, now you can take any new text at all and feed it through the same model and generate a prediction of brain activity. And so they cross-validated this and showed that you could actually predict. Now, how well is sort of, like what is well? I mean, that's sort of a subjective question, right? But certainly far, far above chance, you could predict for many brain regions what the pattern of activity would look like for entirely new stories. So they took new scans from the same subject and showed that you could predict what the brain will be doing in response to a story that the model did not see before. So there's a nice example of an encoding model. And what's interesting is that in practice, actually, a lot of the decoding models people use are really actually encoding models that you sort of invert, right? And so you can do this trick where once you have an encoding model, you can always sort of take the different encodings and ask, like, are they most similar to other stimuli that you encode, right? In other words, if I see a particular pattern of brain activity and I have a large candidate set, I'm asking which of these other 100 faces which of these 100 faces were you looking at when the brain generated this pattern? I can always actually just, if I have an encoding model, encode each of those 100 and then look at, is the observed pattern, which of these is the most similar to? And so you can actually sort of cheat a little bit and turn an encoding model into a decoding model. It's not the only way to do it, but in practice, that's actually very often what you see. And so this is a kind of a nice example of that. This is a more recent study where the authors used what's called a variational autoencoder to train or to extract latent encodings of faces. So they showed participants just a huge number of faces, and they generated, I think, something like 1,000-dimensional representation of that. And this is sort of work that is sort of bog standard at this point in the deep learning literature. People do this with all kinds of things. So this is just purely based on the face data without any brain stuff. But once you have this kind of model, what you can now do is you can take these face embeddings and you can now train a model to predict voxel by voxel brain activity. And so they're building purely a regularized linear regression model using these embeddings for these faces as the inputs. And so that's still an encoding model, right? It tells you, like, if you see this particular face, what is brain activity going to look like? But again, once you have that, you can actually just invert this. So if you have the pattern of activity in the brain, then you can just invert that and go back to you can extract from that the embeddings, the best candidates that would have generated that pattern of activity. And so now you can compare that latent encoding of the face to all of your candidates, and you can generate a prediction for which face the person's looking at. So you can actually now ask, which face is this person looking at, potentially even faces that they've never seen before, right? You might still be able to match that up with some photo. And, again, accuracy, like, you can demand whatever level of accuracy you feel is good, but the point being, you certainly do far, far better than chance using this kind of approach. And so a lot of state-of-the-art decoding approaches in fMRI, and my examples are all fMRI, but the principles apply, to every other neuroimaging method, really. A lot of them are based on this principle that once you have an encoding model, and if you have a set of candidates, you can actually then sort of make guesses about what it is that people are thinking, feeling, etc. The question, what you call the neural spaces are a deep learning model with weights. Stimuli will be the raw data and feature space, the extracted features from the raw data. Yeah, I mean, that's one way to think about it. I mean, the feature space could be anything, right? So it's sort of just a schematically, I just want to give you the sense that, like, you're extracting information from that stimulus, and it could be anything at all. There's sort of, but yes, in this case, you could think of, like, the feature space that you're using. Well, you can think of it in different ways. I mean, you could also think of, like, we happen to know that the faces were the original inputs, but as far as this model being trained is concerned, the input, the stimuli really is just this encoding, right? So, I wouldn't get too hung up on, like, what is the sort of the intermediate representation there. Really, the critical point is really you have the stimulus on one side and the brain on the other side, and anything at all can happen in between those things. And encoding just means you're moving from the world into the brain, and decoding means you're going the other way. Hopefully that helps. Would these models be equally accurate in both directions? No, not necessarily. They could be, but they don't have to be. And one way to build the intuition that they're not is that the accuracy of the decoder in this example you're seeing, for instance, is totally dependent on, like, how big the candidate set is, right? So if you had, like, 1 million candidate faces, and the question you're asking is, let's say you demand that if you're quantifying accuracy in terms of the proportion of the time that the correct face is picked out. Well, if you have a million candidates as opposed to 10, accuracy is going to be much lower when you have a million, right? So the information the model is learning is the same, right? But the point being, the metric of performance is sort of arbitrary. You can make it look like it's doing better or worse based on all kinds of things that have no sort of intrinsic relevance to the information being learned. So it's the same information being learned, yes, and you can use it to different things, but you can make performance metrics in general look very good or very bad just depending on how you construct the problem. So I would, in general, I think it's good to like always be skeptical of like specific numbers, right? Like 98% accuracy means nothing at all unless you know what the metric is and it's actually something you care about, right? Like you will often see, 98% classification accuracy of like autism versus non-autism populations. And it sounds great. Does that mean you could take that model into a clinic halfway around the world and get 98% accuracy on entirely new people? No, of course not, because the population might be different, the scanner might be different, and how the model generalizes is very unclear. So, so it's good in general to be skeptical of performance indicators unless they are exactly the metric that you want when you actually go to apply it in the real world. The question, I'm from computer science, don't have background in neuroscience. PCA, here's principal component analysis, right? Why would you use it with those pictures? So I didn't want to get details, but they just use that as a baseline. So what they do is they use, it's kind of, I think it's a nice and respectful way to deal with machine learning, because it's often the case that people do really fancy stuff and then it turns out like principal component analysis, which is like the first dumbest thing you learn, right? In statistics and machine learning, as far as data reduction, often does like almost as well or as well. And so all they're doing here is showing that if you use PCA, instead of like this very complicated thing here, instead of this like deep learning model, if you use PCA to extract a latent representation, maybe I shouldn't say latent, there's sort of people would argue that PCA is not a latent variable model at all, but just to use some dimensionality reduced here, you can still do reasonably well. So the model is still above chance. So the point is, you don't need all of this apparatus to do reasonably well. It's just you do better than with just PCA. But it's a good question. How often is what we do in the lab creating these models applied in clinic? As far as I know, like basically never right now. I'm not aware of, I'm probably wrong. I'm sure somewhere out there someone has used, maybe in like pre-surgical mapping, but in general, it's extremely rare. Like I don't know of cases where people really have used these kinds of data sets, models trained on these in the clinic. I think that probably the closest thing is you do see these things starting to be used in like radiology. I think there are limited contexts where people already are using deep learning models to do things like tumor identification, et cetera. But as far as like functional MRI or EEG, et cetera, there are probably applications, but they're not common. And I would be very wary of them for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago, which is learning a model in a very limited context offers no promise of generalization. Or you can have like what looks like astonishingly good performance in one setting, and as soon as you change something small, like the population or the scanner or something like that, the model can just go to shit completely. Now, sometimes, let me say though, that sometimes people hear that and they say, oh, well, you see, that's the downside of like this pure like data-driven machine learning type approach. That's why we need like models that we understand, et cetera. And in principle, that sounds good, but it's not really like anyone else has built terribly useful models based on like explanatory modeling approaches. So like, yes, it sounds great in theory to say like, if you understand what's going on, then you should be able to build a model that, works in the clinic in Switzerland, even though it was trained in Palo Alto. But that's an empirical question, and it's actually pretty hard to show that, right? My feeling is if you really want to build generalizable models, what you ought to do is train the models on data sets from all over the world and lots of scanners. And then, in some sense, you don't have to worry about generalization because you're already training the model on exactly the kinds of situations you apply to. So that, I think, is sort of, I'm hopeful the next wave of studies is ones that really sort of try to train models on very large data sets from all over the place instead of very narrow slices and then just like hoping and really wishing that they'll generalize well. Okay, let me move on. I'm moving fairly slowly here. The questions are great, so keep them coming, and I can always skip things that are less important. So another different kind of application of machine learning is to increase sensitivity. So traditional analyses in cognitive neuroscience rely heavily, not just on, at this point, mass univariate GLM, but at least in the task and fMRI world, still, I think that's probably the most commonly used approach in sort of explanatory modeling. And these approaches are largely focused on understanding like mean differences in voxels. So how do different parts of the brain increase or decrease activity when you have people do certain tasks? And these kinds of models miss potentially important signals. In particular, any kind of pattern of activity across multiple voxels is going to be missed by a linear model that just treats every point, every voxel in the brain like a separate universe, essentially, right? If you're not modeling dependence between voxels, then you're not going to have any ability to identify patterns of activity that reflect, so maybe when you look at a particular face, the information isn't encoded in like these four voxels increasing activity. Maybe it's that, some of the voxels go up a little bit, others go down, there's some weird nonlinear dynamics, et cetera. And so, to learn those kinds of patterns, you would need some other kind of approach. And, that's where what people called multivariate, pattern analysis, but really just machine learning, can improve sensitivity. And the idea is just like use all the information you have in one shot. Don't just train a model to predict activity in one isolated voxel each time, because you're losing a lot of potentially useful information. And there have been lots of nice demonstrations of this principle. Here's an example from a few years ago from Russ Poldrak's lab. And so what they did is, I'm not going to, just for the sake of time, I won't describe the task in detail. It's a gambling task. You can either lose money or gain money. Either you lose or or nothing happens, or you win money or nothing happens, two different conditions. And they built a standard traditional linear model, GLM, fit to every voxel, or they used a machine learning approach. Where's my screen? For some reason I can't see my mouse. That's okay. Or they used a spotlight approach where they just fit a model of sliding searchlight. Sorry, they basically slide a sphere across the brain and train a model on information in a bunch of voxels in that sphere. Details are not so important. What you're seeing here will fall out of just almost any kind of application like this. The point is, if you look on the left at the univariate approach, there's just a lot less stuff, right? So the point is, you can predict whether someone, if you use brain activity to try and essentially decode now whether someone is, scratch it, forget the decoding part. If you just look at the association between winning on a trial and brain activity, it looks like there's way less stuff when you're doing sort of the traditional GLM analysis than when you're building a machine learning model, right? Lots of parts of the brain seem like they actually carry information about whether you won or lost that don't show up if you just ask, does this voxel increase in activity on average when people win versus when they lose? So this looks great on the surface. You might say, fantastic. Why would anyone do the thing on the left when you can have all this stuff on the right? But there's something a little bit weird about this. And for those of you who come from a neuroscience or psychology background and know a little bit about the brain, you might find it kind of weird, right? That like on the right, it looks like you're predicting, it looks like, for example, motor cortex carries information about gains and losses, which is a little bit strange. Nobody really thinks of motor cortex as being a part of the brain that represents reward information. And so why is that? Is it a false positive? Well, in one sense, no. I mean, it probably is the case that there really is information in that region about whether people have won or lost on a given gambling trial. But that doesn't mean that you know what that information represents, right? So just because, you construct this in your head, you think of this as like reward versus no reward. So psychologically, you have this sort of sense that like what shows up for this must be information that reflects reward processes. But all you're actually learning, strictly speaking, is that there is information in the brain somewhere in, this pattern is helpful in predicting or discriminating between these two conditions. We have no idea why that is. And you can postulate all kinds of reasons for that have nothing at all to do with the task as you understand it. For example, a very trivial explanation is, maybe people respond more quickly when there's high probability of winning. And so what ends up happening is motor cortex lights up, you respond super quickly, or you're really like enthusiastically punching that button, and you win most of the time, right? And so it's a confound. And it's true to say that motor cortex is carrying information about whether you won or lost, but it's not doing anything psychologically interesting. And now confounds could occur in this approach on the left too, but because it's sort of in some sense less sensitive and has less capacity to pick up on all kinds of patterns, it's also less likely to pick up on confounds, right? So there is no free lunch in the sense that nothing is magic. Just because a technique picks up information more capably does not mean it's somehow magically distinguishing what you would consider signal from what you would consider noise. That still falls on you, but the causal unpacking of that still requires you to do some very careful thinking and analysis, right? And so you will hear people say sometimes, oh, you just get stronger results with multivariate machine learning approaches. And that's true in one sense, but in another sense, the fact that you get more information doesn't mean it's information you care about. And so you always want to be careful, right? And it's not the case that just because more signal shows up in your result, it's better. It may be worse depending on what it is you're trying to do. There's a question. So the sensitivity is the robustness of our model. Basically, too sensitive means learning noise and overfitting. No, it's a good question, but not necessarily. So overfitting would imply that what you're learning. Well, it's okay. It's tricky, right? It depends on what you consider the signal. It may or may not be overfitting. There's different ways to think about it. So, in one sense, this is on the right here is not a false positive, right? It depends. I would say it depends on what you define as a false positive. If the question is what is signal that genuinely predicts these two experimental conditions, then this is potentially all real. The fact that motor cortex is active is that's legit signal. It really, if you care about distinguishing these two conditions, then use motor cortex information. However, if what you care about is the psychology, right, you are actually interested in reward. You don't care about the contrast between these two experimental conditions. You care about the psychological contrast between I won versus I lost. In that case, then you would argue that yes, maybe this is a false positive, right? And so then you could say yes, you're overfitting. But it's a little weird to say that because really what you're highlighting is the problem with your task operationalization, right? Really the point is you shouldn't have used that task in the first place. If you want to be able to draw some quick conclusion these regions are involved in reward, you probably shouldn't have just picked tasks that aren't super well matched on reaction time and potentially many other properties. And so I would say there is overfitting, but in some sense it's actually psychological overfitting, right? The overfitting is happening at the stage of selecting a task that picks up on all kinds of signals besides what you think you care about. And that's a subtle point, but it's an incredibly important one. I would say a huge chunk of inferential errors in psychology and neuroimaging actually stem from this, not from statistical overfitting, but from not thinking carefully about the operationalization of the task or the cognitive process you care about, right? And if you don't think carefully about that, all is lost. You end up in this situation where you say, look, motor cortex, we didn't know this. Motor cortex actually is super important for representing reward. It's not a false positive in a statistical sense, but it's just not giving you information that you care about. So hopefully that helps. I mean, there's subtlety there, but in some ways that's sort of the essence of the problem in thinking about how to go from something happens out in the world to the brain does something and we're trying to understand that. I mean, you really have to kind of have a grasp on what the task is encoding, which may not be what we think or we would like it to be encoding. Okay. I might skip the last part or two, but I'll definitely talk about this because I think one of the, if not the most important takeaway points here comes out of this, and that's cross-validation. So you might have heard quotes to this effect from Richard Feynman. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. Right? The idea is that when you're doing really any kind of science, but neuroimaging is particularly bad because you're working with these enormous data sets and you have just tons of flexibility in how you look at the data. It is incredibly easy to p-hack. You've probably all heard the term p-hacking. This does not imply any malice, right? So I'm not saying it's incredibly easy to commit fraud. That's true too, but p-hacking here just implies, you inadvertently produce results that are not actually valid representations of what's going on. We all fool ourselves very easily if we're not careful. There are thousands of researcher degrees of freedom in neuroimaging, which is to say, you can analyze different parts of the brain. You can use, you can look at different potentials if you're doing EEG. You can correct for multiple comparisons. There's just like no end to the amount of ways you can permute your data. And you eventually will find something if you're not careful and if your goal is just to get a paper, right? Like, it's not hard. Now, machine learning approaches are not at all immune to self-fooling. In fact, there's a growing literature in machine learning talking about how these kinds of problems also arise in machine learning contexts. But it still is the case, I think, that the problem is much smaller there. And that's because it's mitigated by emphasizing certain things that machine learning people tend to take very seriously. So one is out-of-sample prediction via cross-validation, which I'll talk about. The point is, you fit a model on one set of data, and then you test it in a different set of data, right? And so you're dramatically limiting your chances of overfitting or identifying patterns that aren't actually real, because it has to generalize to new data. Regularization and explicit reasoning about bias variance trade-offs. I won't talk about this because I don't have time, but regularization is super important. The idea there is just you're using what you know about the world to introduce bias to your model, but it's good bias, right? You're telling the model, look in this part of the space and don't be super flexible. Don't go like chasing around after every solution just because it looks like it might fit the data better. I know that sounds sort of, if you haven't encountered the idea of regularization, that will sound very mysterious, but I don't unfortunately have time to talk about it here. And lastly, larger samples. So people in machine learning, I think, have learned to take large samples very seriously. And imaging, we tend not to do that, or historically didn't, although I think we've gotten much better. Understandable, because imaging data is often very expensive, at least certain modalities. But, you know, there is a sense in which, like, sometimes your best is not good enough, right? Just because, like, 30 subjects is all you can afford doesn't mean that the result has to be worth doing, right? There's a sense in which, like, some applications might need 3,000 people, and if you can't get it, then, like, tough, right? Like, the fact that you can only get 50 does not help. Cross-validation is probably the single most important approach here. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, take this away, because you can cross-validate almost any kind of analysis, no matter what kind of science you're doing. So this is the critical point. True prediction implies generalization of new data. Like, if I say I have a model that can predict what face you're looking at, I do not mean, presumably, if I apply that model to faces that you have already seen in the data set that I have, I can identify the correct answer, because I already know the answer. It's in the data, right? Like, if that was what I cared about, I wouldn't need the model at all. I would just look at my data set and say, like, oh yes, on trial 14, this person was looking at this face. 100% accurate, right? I don't need a model. The only point of training a model is if you want to generalize to new data, like the data that you've seen, but not exactly the same. But that implies that you cannot train and test the model in the same data set, because if you do, your model will find it easy to cheat generally. Right? You're training a model on one data set. It can capitalize on anything in that data set that helps it identify the correct answer. But the things it's capitalizing on, the things it's learning, the patterns it's seeing, may be hallucinations. They may not exist in another data set drawn from the same population. And so it's really, really critical that when you see a claim like this, and these are all over psychology and neuroscience, right? Like, my model can predict 70% of the variance in something. Be very skeptical. Rarely is this true unless that result is cross-validated. And I'll skip this in the interest of time. This is just like a little of kind of shoulder padding to show that psychologists were actually some of the first people to talk about cross-validation. So you can go back and look at this Mosier quote later in 1951. But the point being, like, you have to train and test your model on different data sets. And there are different ways of doing that. The most common in practice is something called k-fold cross-validation. There's implementation of this in, like, every major machine learning package. I think you'll probably see something like sklearn later. And sklearn has all kinds of cross-validation utilities you can use. And the idea is simple. Many of you will have seen this, I'm sure. You take your data set, and let's say you're doing 10-fold cross-validation. That means you split up your data set into 10 sort of equal-sized chunks, and you use 9/10 of the model, or 9/10 of the data, sorry, 9 of those 10 folds to train. So the blue here is your training set. And once you've trained the model, you then take that fitted model exactly as it is, and then you use it to generate predictions for what's called the holdout, or the validation set, the 10% that the model was not trained on. So you get scores for those 10%, you set them aside. And then you take a different 10%, a different fold as the validation set, use the rest to train the model, and repeat. And at the end, once you've generated predictions for the holdouts, you average those. And so the point is, the critical point here is, what's really elegant about this kind of approach is you've used every single data point, both for training and for evaluation, but never at the same time. And so the bias is dramatically decreased, right? It's an almost unbiased approach that gets generally very close to sort of the performance you would have seen if you had trained and tested on completely different data sets. So this is a implementationally very easy to do because you just need a for loop essentially, and almost any model can be cross-validated. And so no matter what it is you're doing, you're like, think seriously about cross-validating. If you report R-squared metrics or mean squared error or something, you almost are guaranteed to be able to cross-validate that. And the cross-validated value is really what you should report in your papers, not the sort of potentially overfitted R-squared that looks fantastic. Questions? Is this the same as leave one out method? At the limit. So leave one out is just what happens when you push K, when you keep increasing K until it's the size of the data set. Right? So if you have 100 subjects in your data set, if K is 100, then you're doing cross-validation, or you're doing leave one out. You're using 99 subjects to train, 1 to test. So yes, at the limit. Leave one out is the limit of K-fold. How should you choose K for K-fold validation? That's an excellent question. There's a lot of argument over that. There's no single right answer because it will vary by data set, and there are interesting trade-offs. It used to be like the consensus was like 3 to 5 or 3 to 10, something in that range is fine. There was this dogma for a long time, which I until recently believed too, that you should avoid leave one out. There's actually no good reason behind that, it turns out, other than computationally it's more expensive. That said, like, if you pick a value of like 5 or 10, nobody's going to blink. And you probably shouldn't try to optimize that because then you're at risk of overfitting yourself, right? So like, you don't want to like start playing around with K and pick the one that gives you the best result. So pick, 5 and just go with that. And you're probably okay. Trying to optimize that, I think, is probably a bad idea. There are lots of decisions that like feel unprincipled, and your tendency might be to say when you do the analysis, like, I need some good reason for picking this. But what you should worry about much more, I think, is arbitrary decisions are okay. Like, I'm not saying they're good. Like, it would be good if there's a principled reason, but lots of decisions are arbitrary. And the bigger concern is that you're not biasing your result, right? So like, it's better to pick like a looks reasonable number like 5 than to like start testing everything, in a way that biases you to find the answer that quote unquote works best. Then you're just overfitting again. There are ways to optimize K by doing things like, like you could do nested cross-validation. There are schemes for doing that. But honestly, like in most applications, if that matters a lot, probably you just need a larger data set. Like there's not really many cases, I think, where like you should be thinking very deeply about like, should K be 4 or 6? Not much should hang on that. Now, the industrial strength way to do this, actually not to use sort of, not to split your data in 2, but to split it into 3. So in industry, for example, people typically proceed this way. They will take the data set, they will split it into testing and training, just like you saw before, but now they will set that test aside completely, and they will just not look at it. And they will use the training data set and split that. And so now you use the part of that data set as the training, to train your model, and then you validate on the holdout, right? And you do cross-validation just like you saw in the previous slide. But now once you've done training your model with cross-validation, you've decided, this is the final model, this is the one that's best. Only now do you go back to that test data. And you get one shot at this, right? So this is where you essentially, you've already written your paper. You could think of it as like, you set aside the test, you go write your paper, and you just leave the actual final numbers blank. And only when you've written the entire paper and everything's done except for plugging in those numbers, do you now go back and fit that one model. You get no more than one shot at it. Right? And that's really the best way to make sure that you don't fool yourself, because you don't have the option then to look at it, that number, and be like, oh, the test value is only, 54%. That's not great. I must have screwed something up. I'll go back and look and try to tweak things, right? Because then you're just optimizing to get a better number in the test, and it's no longer independent. So the downside of this, of course, is you lose data. Every time you split your data, you lose some of it. And so this is, again, another reason why you need to have large samples. Do you get 10 different models then because they are trained on 10 different subsets of the data? Yes, you do. And so it's important to realize that cross-validation, generally, it's not a way of it's not, again, we're doing prediction here. We're not doing explanation, right? So you will get a different model in every single fold. And the goal of this exercise is to determine how well the functional form of the model you have does, and not to learn the model, not to learn the specific parameters. Right? To learn the specific parameters, you would use all the data. So the point being is like when you actually want, so if you're training a model you then want to take into the clinic, you would cross-validate initially to get an estimate of how well your model does. But when it comes time to actually train a model, you wouldn't like take one of those folds and take that model, or like pick the best fold or something. You would train the model on the whole data set. And so that's the model you would use for actual application. And the cross-validation would have been useful just to get an estimate of how well that does in an unbiased, minimally biased way. Okay. I have a little bit of backstory here about how I got into this, and but it takes some time to explain, and honestly, it's not that important. Well, let me just make this point very quickly. It used to be that people would publish papers with like sample sizes of 14 people saying, hey, look, we understand personality traits like extroversion. There's a correlation of 0.8 between amygdala activation and the neural response to faces, right? And that's essentially saying like there is nothing more to a trait like extroversion than amygdala activity, because 0.8 is about the reliability of the measure. So it looked like we'd already solved a lot of problems in like 20 years ago. And this, when I was looking at this in grad school, I thought, this is fascinating. I'm going to go study this and we'll solve all these problems really quickly. Well, flash forward almost 20 years, and this is a very similar kind of analysis done in the HCP data set by Julien Dubois and colleagues. And the same kind of analysis now routinely gets you like, 2% of the variance using the same kinds of measures and the same kinds of tasks. So what we learned from this is that we've gone from like 80% of the variance in 2001 to 2% of the variance in 2018. Like we are losing like 5% a year in our ability to do good work in science. That's the conclusion you should draw. Right? Hopefully that's not what you take away from this. Like we haven't got really bad at doing science. You could tell that story. You could say, well, clearly these new studies are bad and we used to be much better at this stuff. But obviously the correct narrative is that we are just better not fooling ourselves now. The old studies with these absurd R-squareds did not cross-validate. So they did not prevent themselves from fooling themselves. And when you cross-validate properly, it turns out these effects are just small. They really are. I mean, you see this in clinical applications too, right? It's actually incredibly difficult to predict, symptom change or even just like the degree of symptoms patients manifest when you do that in a sort of minimally biased way, cross-validating. And large samples are what guards, or one of the things that guards against that. And the point here is just that it's harder to overfit when you have larger samples. So suppose you have some true function in the population that looks like this red line. That's the ground truth. And that ground truth generates these two samples, the green dots, or the green squares, and the blue dots. The green is the training sample, right? So if you train a linear model, not a quadratic model, but a linear model to fit these green squares, or say the blue dots, sorry, that's the training, you end up with a straight line. Why? Because a linear model can't curve, right? Or at least and so you're never going to capture the true relationship here. And so you might think, well, the problem is I'm using this linear fit. I need a quadratic model. That gives me some flexibility. But why stop at quadratic, right? Why not go up to like 10th order polynomial? That's super flexible. We'll make sure we can capture any possible like quirk in the data. And you fit that and you get this like beautiful line. This is a 10th order polynomial regression fit. And lo and behold, your training error is much lower than the linear model. Now, does this look good just because the error's gone down? Hopefully you say no, right? Like you can see that this is a very odd fit. And one way to see that is if you had collected new data represented by these green squares, this new model is now doing horribly. Like it fits the blue data really well, but it doesn't capture the green squares at all, even though they're drawn from the same actual population. Remember, the ground truth is this red line here. Now, what would happen if you did exactly the same exercise with like 200 data points instead of 20? On the left, you still can't do well with the linear model. It's too inflexible. It can't curve. So there's nothing you can do, right? It can only you have two parameters. You have the intercept and the slope. So all it can do is this basically, but it can never capture that nonlinearity in the data. And so you will always do horribly with this model then you'll do badly no matter how big your sample is. There's nothing you can do about that. However, notice that if you use the overly flexible model on the right side here, it's actually not going off the rails, right? Even though it's in theory much, much more flexible than the actual ground truth, it still looks actually reasonably okay. Within the range of the data, you're actually capturing that red line fairly well. Why is that? It's because the data is pushing back on this kind of thing, right? Like you can't fit this crazy line now because there are more data points. Like there's a data point, like imagine where the blue line is coming down here, right? So like there's another blue data point here now that says, no, you don't go all the way down there because the error would be enormous. And so the data is kind of pushing back on your ability to generate this crazy fit. And that's, in a nutshell, why large samples are good, right? Because even a model that's wrong, in the sense that it's too flexible, will be limited in the amount of damage it can do by the amount of data you have. And the more data you have, the less of a problem overfitting is, and the more flexible the model you can actually use before you run into problems. So the two lessons here, again, I didn't talk about regularization, but large samples and cross-validation, really, really helpful for identifying problems in your data. There's a question here, if we don't have access to data from all the planet, how do we collect them so they can be representative? You can't, right? I mean, there is no deterministic way to know that the data you collect is representative of what you care about. That is a huge challenge. And that's okay. Certainly not saying like, oh, if you can't collect data from China and Mali and Montreal, then you shouldn't bother like training a model to like identify schizophrenia. But you should be modest. Right, so fine, you have data in Montreal, it's from a particular scan, that's fine, train the model, report it, but just say like, look, we have no guarantee that this will actually generalize until someone actually does that work. That is in some ways the hardest problem, is the generalization from what you have to what you actually would like to be able to apply to. And there's no guarantee of representativeness. That's just something you sort of hope is the case. I always have this question, when we use k-fold cross-validation and split the data set randomly, every time we execute the model, we will reach different accuracy. In some projects, I thought the difference between mentioned accuracy is significant. Yeah, so that's an excellent point. Cross-validation, as long as you're not fixing the random seed, which you shouldn't really, unless you need to like reproduce results perfectly, is random, right? Like every time you resample your data, because you're splitting randomly, you will get a different result. And if you're seeing very different accuracy estimates every time you rerun your cross-validation procedure, what you should take that as a sign of, well, two things. Number one, you can generate uncertainty estimates that way, right? So you can actually just rerun the thing over and over and like report like, 95% of our estimates fall within this range. That's actually, I think, a reasonable thing to do. It's analogous to confidence intervals. But the other way to think about it is if the estimates you're getting are just wildly varying, that's a sign that you don't have enough data. Because if you had like 1 million data points and your model is not like, your model has like, 10 parameters, that will not happen. You will not get like radically different estimates. They will converge very quickly because they're stabilizing just like I showed you here. Right? And so one of those two things, like definitely it's good to report sort of like uncertainty about the cross-validation estimate. But if you still are seeing just like radically different numbers, then that's a sign that you just don't have enough data for that procedure to help you. If you cross-validate and regularize correctly, would the results from the two small sample studies be comparable to one larger study? That's an interesting question. It depends. The problem there is, I mean, yes, in some sense, right? The problem is that you have to have some way of combining those. So like if I hand you like two estimates from small studies, how do you combine them to get a one estimate? And like, for example, there are meta-analytic procedures you can use, and I'm actually not sure off the top of my head if like it's sort of guaranteed asymptotically that those are equivalent. Well, I guess it is if depending on, let me put it this way. If you are using a sensible meta-analytic model, and the data are truly drawn from the same sample as they would have been if you just like had one big sample, then yes, it should be the case that, given enough data, those things will converge. However, if the question you're asking is like, if I have two samples that are basically identical in the sense they really are drawn from the same generating process, you will sometimes hear people say, well, like I'm going to use like to ask, like, is it better to do like two separate things, and that gives you some more insight? And the answer is no. Like, there's no, if you have two data sets that are identical, just combine them, right? You gain nothing by splitting them up, because then you just have to have some combining rule to think about, and there's more room for like fooling yourself, etc. So now, what you would not want to do is just like take 10 different data sets that like differ in their underlying the underlying population, like they come from different scanners or something, and just like collapse them without any sort of indicators as to where they came from, right? So, but but like there's rarely, I can't think of really any good reason, except cross-validation in this like particular way. I would never like take a data set, split it into two, treat one as study one and study two if they're like basically the same data set. Right? That buys you nothing. The only application is something like cross-validation, where you're doing like discovery and then replication. And that's essentially kind of like cross-validation in a stronger form, because you're using completely different data sets. And if you have the sample size for that, do that. But don't ever like do sample one, fit the model, get the estimates, sample two, fit the model, get the estimates, and then try to combine those. You just may as well fit one big model and take those estimates. Okay. Keep the questions coming. I mean, I'll probably just go till 9:30, given that people are asking questions now. So I probably won't leave time at the end. So if you have questions, just fire at will. What about simpler description? So another thing you see machine learning used for quite often is to simplify the data. Neuroimaging data in particular are extremely high dimensional. So if you think of a typical fMRI time series, right, you might have 20 subjects times 100,000 voxels times 1,000 time points, right? That's just billions of data points. And humans are not good at thinking in billions of dimensions. So the hope is that there's something you can do to extract lower dimensional descriptions that facilitate insight or understanding. And this is where unsupervised machine learning comes into play. Unsupervised machine learning, you can think of as structure finding. In supervised machine learning, you have an answer, right? So you're training a model to recapture the ground truth, which you know. In unsupervised machine learning, there is no ground truth. You're just trying to find interesting patterns in the data, and different algorithms just have different definitions of what interesting means. So the goal is to reduce this giant mass of data down to some smaller or simpler structure, but how you do that is very open. And lots of the work that people have been doing in the imaging literature for the last 20, 25 years, particularly the last 10, I'd say, is really aimed at this kind of analysis, right? It's not supervised. It doesn't start from, we know the answer, we're trying to build a model to predict it. It starts from like, we have this data and we just want to extract what looks like sensible structure from us, finding structure. And the thing is, there is a lot of structure in the brain. So there's a lot of structure in your imaging data. And you can use all kinds of approaches. I'll just talk about a couple of them. You can do things like PCA or ICA. So ICA was one of the first techniques to be used. This is a seminal study from Steve Smith and colleagues in collaboration with the Brain Map group 10 years ago now, or more than 10 years, where they fit an ICA model, which detects independent components in the data, to both resting state fMRI data and to meta-analytic data in the database called Brain Map. And it's a really nice study because they show that they could extract the same components generally. So each of these figures shows you a different component. And on the left, you have resting state data. On the right, you have meta-analytic data extracted from publications. And you can see that many of the components actually look very similar. So that's really cool because it says that you can observe the same kinds of patterns at different levels. And then they show that these patterns can load on different psychological processes, identifying some structure in the brain. So that's sort of one of the earlier examples with ICA, which people still use for lots of things. Many of you will probably be familiar with this paper, Thomas Yo's group, in 2011, and people still use these networks quite a lot. And so they took a very large sample of 500 subjects, and they did parcellation. Actually, to be honest, I don't even remember what the method they used was. They used some clustering method, and extracted these particular 7 networks and also 17. You might ask why 7 and 17, and I think one of the things I like about this paper is they didn't like try to bullshit you and say like, oh, there's some mathematical reason why 7 is a holy number. They said like, look, 7 is a low dimensional coarse grained number, and you might also want something a little more precise, like more nuanced, and so 17. And they did have some metrics where, like 7 was the minimum, but I could tell you from experience, these things are really pretty arbitrary. Like you could rerun the thing with slightly different data and like 6 is the optimum, right? And I'll come back to this point in a second. So just be aware, there's no, the ground truth looks nothing like any of these solutions, right? These are just sort of ways to describe the space in a way that we humans find useful. If you like the 7 network model, great. If you like the 17, great. You could also have pulled out a 22 network model and that would look good too, and you could have used that as well, right? So don't think of these as like identifying the ground truth. They're just identifying regularities, and there's lots and lots of different ways to carve up the space that could be just as good. And then you come to things like this, the Glasser et al. Atlas, which uses sort of multimodal data from the Human Connectome project to identify parcels. And again, these are like now using different criteria, so you end up with a different solution, different number of clusters. And is this better than the previous one? And the answer is it depends. It depends on what criteria you care about. Does it matter to you that this is constrained by different modalities? Maybe, but on the other hand, if you're just doing functional MRI, maybe you don't care about like structural constraints. Like, why would that be a thing you care about, right? You might be happy with this. Maybe you think 200 parcels is too fine-grained for what you're doing, right? So you have to match the solution to your goals and your preferences. Let me skip this in the interest of time just to show that other sort of very different kinds of things you can do. In this case, you can posit like intermediate cognitive representations as the sort of mediator between tasks and the brain. The main point I want to kind of take the time to point out here, because this like comes up a lot. You will see that a large part of this literature is basically parcellating the brain in various ways, and people have been in this for a long time, right? And most of the parcellations you will see look compelling. Like you will see papers and the pictures look nice, and they map in seemingly sensible ways onto psychology and behavior. And the question you should really be asking is like, how do you comparatively evaluate new proposals? Like what are we actually learning? Are these approaches explanatory? Or do we find them compelling because they just are just low dimensional enough descriptions that we can hold them in our head and reason about the brain? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, right? I mean, like if you can't reason in a billion dimensions, you have to do something to reduce that dimensionality so you can think about like, well, how do different parts of the brain interact and how do networks operate, et cetera. But there's a saying that the map is not the territory, right? You don't want to mistake the map for the territory. In other words, what dimensionality reduction approaches give you is a description that makes certain sacrifices in order to simplify the picture for you. Just like a map is a simplification of the actual territory, but you don't want to mistake the map for the territory. You would never look at like a map of the United States and say, there's something very special about like Iowa. Those boundaries, they must mean something very like structurally important. They're arbitrary. They could have been differently. There's nothing wrong with the boundaries as they are. They might help you understand certain things, but they're not sort of like a deep insight into reality necessarily. And just to kind of drive that point home, let me kind of show you, like, this is just sort of like a toy example, but like, I think for many of us, me included, like our sort of natural mental model of what we're doing, we're clustering, is something like this. Like the ground truth must look like this, right? Let's say this is a model of neurons in some chunk of cortex. And let's say you have like 10 completely separable spatially populations of neurons, right? And so if this was the ground truth and you came along and you didn't know what the labels were, so you see the colors here, but you wouldn't in the real world, this would all be like one color, right? But your goal is to try and identify different populations. And you applied k-means cluster. With 5 clusters, you end up something like this. And that's not quite right, but still it's pretty good, right? You can see that like it separates the big clusters at least quite nicely. And if you did it with 10, then again, it's not perfect, but it's still pretty good. Like if this were the ground truth on the left and your reduction method gave you something like this, you could feel pretty good about yourself, right? Like you're getting like almost everything right. And I think this is sort of our mental model of like, well, the ground truth must be simple because our solutions look so nice. But there's no guarantee at all of that, right? Like worse would be something like this. Here's the ground truth. No reason why you couldn't have 2 populations of neurons in the same chunk of tissue, interdigitated. In fact, we know that's how things operate, right? In much of the brain. Well, if you have something like this, like notice this pink and blue now are spatially overlapping. If you apply the standard clustering algorithm in 2 dimensions to this, you have no hope of recovering this distinction. But you will still get something that looks nice. And if you look at the sort of correspondence between your clusters and some other functional criteria, you will still get what looks like selectivity, because notice that even in cases where these overlap, right, if you carved out this chunk here, and if each of these neuron populations was doing something dramatically different, you would still get selectivity in the sense that it would look to you like you have a cluster that loads on like two functions. And you might even find some way of saying, well, maybe like the core function is whatever seems like unites these two things. So you would convince yourself that you have some deep insight into reality. And in one sense you do, right? There is real structure there. But this is not the same on the right. This is not actually the same as the one on the left. And you would not want to mistake this thing on the right for the truth. And this is bad, but this is not ugly. Ugly would be something like this. Like, what if the ground truth is that there's just like the true process that generates your data is super high dimensional, and it's dimensional in the way that you can't easily recover, right? You don't have any way of like unpacking that space, let's say. And if you apply clustering to that, you can see now that the thing on the left and the thing on the right look very, very different. But even here, it still looks to you like there is some selectivity, like you still get sort of like different loadings for different clusters. It doesn't all look like one homogeneous mess, because there is real structure, and you're finding real structure. You just have to remember that your dimensionally reduced view of the world is really just a very, very sort of impoverished version of reality. And most of the time, I think it's pretty clear this is what we're doing with methods like fMRI, EEG, et cetera. Like the ground truth will look, I mean, this is a two-dimensional example. Of course, the problem is the ground truth is like this, but probably in like, thousands of dimensions. If this is the ground truth, this is what we see when we get data coming out of the scanner. And then we go along and apply clustering methods to it, and we get some that looks like this, right? Now, if you think this is like not realistic, then just ask yourself, like, is it at all a plausible assumption that, I mean, think of the core assumption of like pretty much all parcellation, not all, there's some probabilistic methods that I skipped in the interest of time, but the vast majority of clustering parcellation works makes the assumption like every voxel gets assigned to one cluster. Is that at all like a remotely plausible model of how the brain works, right? That like all the neurons in like a given voxel are doing this one thing. They cluster with these other neurons. Of course not, right? It's a simplifying assumption. There's nothing wrong with it. But again, don't mistake the map for the territory. What we do to get a descriptive handle on a little bit of what might be going on is not the true object of study. The brain is not as simple as our like 100 or 200 parcel models. So one way to think about this, and I've argued we should think about this in a paper with Russ Boldrock a couple years ago, is to think about this pragmatically, right? What these kinds of parcellations are doing is they're not like they're not like carving nature at its joints. They are just ways of clarifying relationships between different processes and different entities that we can use to do useful things. So, from a pragmatic standpoint, I think if you think of a good ontology you can substitute here really just any taxonomy, any model that says you have 200 clusters and this is what it looks like. Think of it as a kind of language that reduces the likelihood of miscommunication between researchers by enabling statements defined in more formal, less ambiguous terms, even when the mapping is still not perfect, right? So when you use like the Yao 7 network model, what that allows you to do is say, we're talking about this parcel or network one in the Yao model, and most people will say, yes, I know what you're talking about, and that's useful. You can do that without implying that like this is like some, there's some platonic frontoparietal network that exists in reality as an independent thing, right? It's a dimensionally reduced representation that's useful for humans to talk about things and make predictions about things, and that's fine. That should be sufficient. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me just sort of breeze through this, and I'll put the slides on somewhere so you'll be able to view the rest of it. But this one's important, so I do want to spend just a moment on it. You will hear people call machine learning a black box very often, and that's not true, or at least it can be true, right? There's lots of networks, like deep neural networks, for instance, that essentially are black boxes. We have no clue what the representations are doing. But some models are actually more interpretable than things like ordinary least squares. And machine learning gives us principled ways to reason about trade-offs between predictive utility and parsimony and interpretability. So I lied. Actually, we'll talk a little bit about regularization just very quickly. there are, for example, versions of regression like L1 penalized or lasso regression that implicitly does feature selection so that you get solutions that are sparser and actually more interpretable than ordinary least squares regression. And this is a little bit of a confusing figure, so I won't take the time to unpack it. All I'll point out is that there's a penalty parameter to the lasso, and as you increase the penalty, you get a sparser and sparser solution. Variables start to drop out. And these are the coefficients of the variables. So as you move to the right, as the penalty increases, you can see that there's like fewer and fewer lines left, which is just a way of saying that if you increase the penalty far enough, you will end up with the number of predictor variables you have left in your equation will drop, until you get 3, 2, 1, and eventually nothing. And so you can actually pick. You can actually decide for yourself, oh, I want a model that's sparse and has, only, you could, 10 variables or something. And that's a more principled way of doing it than some other older approaches like stepwise regression, et cetera. So really the only point I want to make here, and then we talk about this if you're new to machine learning, I would encourage you to read this paper where we talk about what regularization is and walk through this example in much more detail. But the core point I want to make here is that it is not true that machine learning is sort of like, by definition, sort of a black box, right? You can actually use models, you can use certain estimators to improve the interpretability. And the nice thing, though, is that you get a sense of like what the cost of that is, because generally there will be a cost. You generally simplify interpretation at the cost of worse predictions. It's not always true, but it's usually true. And so now you can actually weight these things explicitly by estimating, cross-validation, like what is the predictive performance, and you can decide for yourself, like, would you rather have a really simple model that doesn't do so well predictively, or a black box with 10 billion parameters that you don't understand, but does like a remarkably good job at predicting outcomes you care about. Right? You have that explicit trade-off you can consider. And I think, again, I can't state this for a fact, but it seems to me pretty clear that the narrative that eventually we're going to open the black box and replace all like the complex high-dimensional models with like really simple, elegant ones we understand is, I think, naive and not realistic, right? I think there's a reason why the models that do language translation, image recognition, and things like that really well are models that have architectures that look like the human brain. They have like just like millions and millions, in some cases billions and billions of parameters, and they're messy. And that complexity is probably real. You probably need all of that computational power to do the task. It's not like evolution just came up with this really messy approach, but we could do much better. We could do it with like 100 parameters if we just figure out the clever algorithm that's actually being implemented under the hood. Maybe, but there's no obvious reason why I think that should be true. Question. Between feature selection and regularization, which one would you suggest to go for? There's no answer I can give other than it depends. It really just, it would be nice if there were like simple heuristics, but it really depends. And they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I think regularization is generally a good idea. If you know something about the domain, then regularize, right? Use the knowledge you have to bias your solution in a good way. And the same is true for feature selection. If you have good insights about what features tend to matter, then do that. But there unfortunately is no. This is what makes machine learning difficult, is like all of the nuances, and it's the devil's in the details. I mean, like the concepts, sure, you get them, but then like understanding like when should you use this kind of feature selection, when should you use this particular regularization, that's what people do PhDs for and spend, careers developing that kind of knowledge. So unfortunately, there's no easy way around that. Okay, I'll skip this because in some ways I think it's actually kind of obvious. Like I think you can probably come up with ways of using machine learning to advance interesting theoretical questions. And again, that paper, Yarkoni and Westfall 2017, we talked about some examples. So if you want examples, you can go look at those. And the same, I'll just very quickly point out that studying artificial neural networks can actually provide insights into the computations performed by the human brain. So there's an increasingly large literature asking questions like, does the hierarchical structure we observe in the mammalian visual system emerge naturally from certain computational architectures? Like if you've worked with CNNs at all, you'll know that they sort of naturally tend to develop more and more abstract representations of higher layers. And that's remarkably like what we observe in the human brain, right? Where like higher levels of visual hierarchy are increasingly abstract and detached from the spatial context, for instance, in order to represent object categories. And so lots of work tries to look at that. And I'll skip this like giant figure just to kind of make the point that a recurring theme that comes out of this kind of work is that, yes, in fact, without any sort of bias in artificial neural networks, very similar kinds of architectural principles tend to fall out. With like higher levels of the network tend to correlate better with parts of the brain that are sort of higher in visual or language hierarchies. So that's a really cool result. It suggests, again, that this complexity is not there just as an accident. Like you probably need something with this kind of computational horsepower to do the tasks that humans do, that mammals do, right? Like object recognition is not easy enough that you could do it with like 100 variables. And you need very powerful architectures with lots and lots of units connected densely in order to be able to identify people and produce language, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so hopefully folks got a chance to ask questions they had. Feel free to email me if you have questions I didn't get a chance to answer. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of the sense of like some of the benefits of machine learning to neuroimagers, and that they range really from sort of intrinsically important to prediction applications all the way through like, asking questions that can be answered using machine learning methods. And along the way, I tried to give you some like a taste of some of the important concepts like supervised versus unsupervised machine learning, cross-validation, which is super important. And again, the hope is that even if like some of you I know are coming from machine learning, computer science, but for those of you who are on the neuroscience or psychology side, you don't have to be a machine learner to benefit, right? I mean, the point is that just like getting a sense of the philosophy and understanding some of the basic practices like cross-validation, I think can be super helpful in the kind of work you do and in keeping yourself honest and making sure that you produce results that hopefully actually have some potential application, possibly far down the line at the end of the day. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your time. I guess I have like 1 minute. So do you have any specific books you're recommend to learn more, especially from neuroimagers? Not yet. So I am in theory working on a book with Ariel Rokum, who I co-direct Neurocademy with. So at some point we will have a neuroimaging data science book to talk about. I'm sure there are other good texts. I will say that like there's not actually that much that's specific to. Well, okay, let me take this back. I can't think of a book, but I would direct you to like the NiLearn documentation, which is fantastic, and you can learn a lot about machine learning in imaging context by using NiLearn. So let me stop there because I don't want to run into other people's time. So thanks.
Thanks. So thanks so much. That was excellent, and I think I really like the interactive aspect of the talk. That's fantastic. I don't know. I suppose we don't have time for more questions, Lex.
Oh yeah, we're fine.
We have time?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if people can unmute. I mean, like if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask a question, like we do have time. While there are more questions coming up, I just want to maybe ask one question. Like, how do you think of the? I mean, we've seen that like a small sample size is a problem, and then of course cross-validation was partly an answer to that. Do you think that we are still doing cross-validation on sufficiently small samples, such that we will find out that if we actually test our models on other cohorts, other samples, those are going to fail, or are we in a better place now? I mean, I guess we are in a better place, but how bad is the situation with respect to this generalization on other cohorts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think you could think of cross-validation in different ways, right? So there's a nice review paper by Wani Wu in Tor Rager's group, Nature Reviews Neuroscience, I think 2017, maybe 16. I'd encourage you to read it. It's about pain, but there's a really nice figure in there that kind of makes the point that, you can think of like where we want to be is sort of like full generalization across populations, scanners, et cetera, right? But we tend to start out from like, let's just generalize to new subjects, not even new subjects. Let's start by generalizing to new trials from the same subject, right? I'm not saying that's trivial, but that's like the easiest thing you could do. Beyond that, there's generalizing to new subjects. And those things like people do now routinely in the neuroimaging literature. pretty much everyone who's doing machine learning neuroimaging is cross-validating at that level. Now so you can have like exquisite performance cross-validated on the data you have. Let's say you have like some model that in the Human Connectome project with like 1,200 subjects performs like 98% accuracy. So that gives you some confidence that if you were to collect new data from the HCP, you would do really well. The problem is no one's collecting new data from the HCP, and that's not what we care about, right? And so the generalization to new data sets requires new data. And now that doesn't mean that you can't cross-validate across sites. In fact, I would argue that that's exactly what we should be doing, right? It's just really hard, right? So nothing prevents you, and I sort of present it as like cross-validation, like just randomly splitting your data. It doesn't have to be random. You can, in fact, it's a good idea to split on stratify on certain variables. So for example, train a model on female participants, see if it works for men, or vice versa, right? Then you've learned whether this model actually can generate. Now, there aren't, you're not going to like discover entirely new sexes, so that maybe not the best example. But if you had like 10 different sites, don't just randomly split your data. Do it by site. Take 9 sites, train the model, see how it works for the 10. And if you have a model that on the 10 sites you've trained seems to generalize well, then you're much more confident than like if an 11th site comes along that you haven't seen before, but it's broadly from the same population as these other 10, you should still do pretty well. And so you can use cross-validation to directly assess generalizability in that way. And that's a really important point. I say whenever you have the capacity to do that, whenever you have the ability to split your data not just randomly, but on things like sites or like demographic group, age group, things that you might want to generalize to, then do that and see how well your model does.
Great. Any other questions?
There's a question in the Q&A that was just asking about other modalities. So I apologize for not using other examples. And the main reason is just that everything I showed you is sort of general to other modalities, right? So it doesn't apply just to fMRI. The examples for fMRI, but exactly the same principles apply to EEG, MEG, skin conductance, fNIRS. Like, there's no reason any of this wouldn't apply, except obviously that some methods have like higher dimensionality in like space or time, but the principles remain the same. And not just neuroscience either. I think a lot of these ideas will help in behavioral psychology as well, and other domains. There's a question, when performing feel free to stop me from running over time. I don't know what the time constraints are. When performing cross-site harmonization, shouldn't this also be done with cross-validation? Yes, absolutely. So that was exactly the point I was making, that you should, I think you want to combine sites to train your model because it's going to have a very hard time otherwise, but you also want to leave out sites and show that if you train on like these 10, you can predict the 11th, right? That's incredibly important. Do you think knowing when and where and when stuff happens in the brain helps us knowing how it happens? That's, I think that's a question that everyone needs to answer for themselves. And part of the problem there is that I have maybe a fairly cynical view of what understanding is, in the sense that I think it's like a lot of it is just aesthetic preference, right? Like take a conversation between like cognitive neuroscientists, systems neuroscientists, and molecular neuroscientists, right? It typically goes something like systems neuroscientists will say, well, okay, it's great that you like are interested in frontal cortex, but that's super vague. Like, what the hell is frontal cortex, right? I mean, that's like tens of billions of neurons. And I'm interested in understanding the real stuff, which is how these things form assemblies and what the properties are of different circuits. And then molecular neuroscience says, well, that's silly. Like, you know nothing unless you know how the molecules within an individual neuron, like, you understand nothing. And there's no right answer here, right? It's just basically like it's a matter of aesthetic preference. And so, I don't like to get into arguments over like what is real understanding of like mechanism. I think it's good to start by saying like, look, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I consider a good explanation. It's totally okay if like, you don't find fMRI useful because you're doing molecular neuroscience. I totally get that. And the inverse is also true, right? Like, if you're interested at a high level in like how brain networks interact, does it really matter to you to know that like some protein in some particular kind of neuron behaves in this way? Probably not. And this also, I will make the following point though, which this is why I think machine learning is kind of nice, right? In the sense that there is no fact of the matter about like what is a good explanation, in the sense people can just disagree because they value different levels of description. But if you can articulate like a practically important outcome, that's, I think, easier to get agreement on. Like, you can maybe dislike a model aesthetically, but like if it classifies schizophrenics for controls with 99% accuracy, it does something, right? And you can say, I don't like that model, but if you only have an alternative that is a chance, then people can say, well, I'm going to take this one because I'm a clinician. I don't really care like whether it's super high level area explanation or super low level nuts and bolts. So I think the question is are there trends in neuroscience that could be answered by machine learning? That, I think, that's a hard question to answer. I think that the answer broadly is yeah. Well, so I will say this. I mean, there's lots of answers one could give, but I think the encoding and decoding framework is probably the most general way to answer that, which is, in general, I think lots of the applications come down to either trying to figure out how the brain is encoding information, or can we get to a point where we can look at brain activity, extract it via some modality, and infer what is going on, right? So those are, I would say, two very broad patterns that I think there's a lot of interest in. Beyond that, I'm sure there's lots of specific trends that people could talk about.
So if you have Git installed somewhere, if you run the git clone command here, you'll end up seeing MLCN. And if we look at the contents, we should see this notebook. Then if we go into that directory, we can start our notebook. Which should look something like this. All right. So Tao's talk was super great. The only issue is that it spoiled some of the surprises I had throughout the notebook. But keep in mind the contents of the talk, and then see if you can catch the intentional errors that were put into the notebook before they get pointed out. So first question is, what is machine learning? So on the one hand, it is the field of how to generate algorithms that can teach themselves to make better predictions. For our purposes, machine learning, we're going to be focused mostly on the models, which is essentially just a set of parameters that can use data to improve the model's own predictions. So the idea is that by exposing a whole bunch of data to the model, we can get it to improve its predictions. The main advantage of this is it's a lot faster, a lot easier, and a lot more objective than if we were doing this manually. So you can reduce a lot of machine learning analysis to this kind of schematic, where it's just you've got some input data, you've got some model in the middle, and then you have your output or prediction. And the point of the model is to modify its parameters so that when it does make a prediction, it matches the labels that we have given our data. So I'm going to introduce a bunch of terminology. I put a bunch of examples at the top of the notebook. You don't have to memorize all of these, but they are there for easy reference, just to make sure that you can follow. Now, one of the things which we kind of want to emphasize with this workshop is our goal is to teach you how to read and recognize what is being described in a paper. So this is a 1-week course where we're only doing morning teaching, or teaching in the morning. And there are semester-long courses on machine learning with a whole bunch of prerequisites that we cannot hope to imitate. So it's best to see this as a course in literacy and not a course in literature. So by the end of this, we're hoping that you can run through a couple of simple models, train something, and be able to recognize what is being discussed in a given paper. So one of the first things that we're going to do is just do a quick warm-up in Python. So for you to go through the instructions, we're going to start with just quick warm-up exercise that we're going to use, whose outputs we're going to use later. So we want you to define a function called createData, which takes in two values, x1 and x2, multiplies each by input scalars, sums them, and adds a random number. After this, we're going to use that function to generate hundreds of points. So the first thing we do is that we break down the requirements. What are the expected inputs? What are the expected outputs? So the expected inputs, we have two sets of values, x1 and x2. And then we have two scalars that we're going to call beta1 and beta2. So our function should have 4 inputs. Then what are the expected outputs? So the description gives us the set of operations that we need, which is just multiply x1 by beta1, x2 by beta2, sum, and add a random number. So what we're trying to implement is this equation here. So one of the things that we need to do is add a random number. So how do we generate a random value? Well, Python is great because it has a whole bunch of modules that you can import and a whole bunch of code which is publicly available that you can have access to just by using import. So one of the ones that's going to be useful is numpy.random.randn, which is it produces a random value which is sampled from a Gaussian distribution. So now that we have our specs, we can create a function. And I'm not sure if Get covered how to create functions in the first day, but this is what the structure is. So we have the def keyword, short for define, which signals the start of function definition. And then this kind of structure. So def, the name of our function, and then the list of inputs, ending with a colon. We separate each input by a comma. And there are multiple ways to define functions, but this one is sufficient. So in our case, we want to use def create data, x1, x2, so on. And lastly, we want to finish it off using the return keyword. And what that does is that it returns the value stored in variable y to whatever code calls the function create data. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just fill in the blanks here. And then don't forget to just look at the specs if you're not sure what it should be outputting. Okay. And if you have any questions or if you're not sure about something, feel free to ask us. And then we'll wait a few minutes for people to catch up. Once you've completed this, run the next cell, and then this should output some number without an error. So just a note on Jupyter, if you press Shift Enter, it'll execute the current cell. So for example, if I make a new cell here and I do something like print chicken, I can press Shift Enter, and then it's going to run things in this cell. And then once you're done, and then you can run this second cell without error, raise your hand. Oh man, people are so much faster than I expected. It's fantastic. So there was a question about whether I'm going to show the answer, and well, I mean, it's not really a secret. So yes, I'll definitely show it. If you look at the MLCN directory that you cloned, you also see a directory called solutions. But, don't look at that yet. It's good if you fall behind and you want to make sure to catch up. But don't cheat. So there's a question here. How does numpy.random.randn choose a range? So the way it does that is, so randn is specifically a unit, normally distributed. It's normally distributed with a zero mean and unit variance. So depending on what properties you want your Gaussian to actually have, then you shift it by adding something, and then you increase or decrease the variance by multiplying by something. Or is it normally distributed? Yes, that's exactly what that is. Okay. So because I'm not crazy enough to do coding in live, I'm just going to go ahead and cheat and get the answers. Sure, not there. They're over here. So when we execute this cell with Shift Enter, we're going to see a number appear here. Then when we execute the next cell, we should see a value printed out here. So you can change the values that you put in, but they'll generally be centered around 9. So every time you run this cell, you should obtain some new number. So some will be a little higher, a little lower than 9. So one of the things that we said that we were interested in using this function for is to generate hundreds of points. Now, one of the ways we could do this is just put it in a loop and then append to some list and so on. So we have our x1 list, our x2 list, our output, we put it in a loop, and then we append. So if we run this cell, we see that our y here now contains 3 values. And if we just kept running this, we'll see that all the values are roughly centered around, I think, 17 and 4 or something. But in terms of code development, this is a little messy. So if the purpose is for a function to generate hundreds of points, we might as well just do that from the get-go. So in this second section, instead of having the loop outside the function, we'll just put the loop inside the function. So here, this is just so that people couldn't peek. Copy and paste the same code that we had previously. So here we're redefining the function create data. We're calling for some random value. We're computing it. And then we're going to append it to that list. Then if we run this, no error, which is expected. And if this was properly defined, we'll see. This is why we don't code live.
Hey, Lex.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of people in the Slack who are having trouble from Windows just opening the Jupyter notebook. And I'm wondering if it's worthwhile just quickly explaining how the instructions are different to open it in Windows, because there's like several people who are behind now.
Okay.
When I'm troubleshooting with them, they're saying the command Jupyter is not found. I say to use conda activate to get in the conda environment.
Yeah, so if they're on Windows, they're not going to be working from the same terminal.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so
Let me go
maybe could you
find
just
that.
explain how they would do it in Windows?
So if you go to the linked setup instructions, there's a section on Windows 10, and then Jupyter Notebook here. So we want to first go to the Anaconda Navigator, do start, search for Anaconda Navigator, look at Jupyter Notebook, and then you'll want to go navigate to where you stored the MLCN repo. So if you just wanted to create one, you'd do this. Otherwise, you just navigate to where you actually stored, where you stored the MLCN data. Yeah, I don't have a good sense of whether that's still that's sufficient, but
Yeah, I think that probably would help. I think they were just trying to do it in the same way as people on Mac and Linux, and that was the problem.
Yeah. There we go. All right. Yes, I ran them. Okay. So here we have our function, and now we can just create a whole bunch of different points. So now that we have our function to generate a whole bunch of simple data, we're going to move on to the first sklearn example. So sklearn is kind of the short way of saying scikit-learn. Other ways to say it is sklearn. Some of the developers call it sklearn, and I don't like it, but you know, as long as we're all talking about the same thing, it's fine. So as we mentioned earlier, a model is simply a collection of parameters which are applied to some input data in order to make some prediction. So as an example, when we're doing linear regression, which if you've done either linear algebra or if you've done some GLM, you've done linear regression. So the model that linear regression uses is something like y, your output is equal to some weighted sum of inputs, which not accidentally looks a lot like the function that we just created. So the parameters for the model beta, the parameters for the linear regression model are the betas here. So for any given model, our interest is in finding values for beta which make the best prediction. So one of the really nice things about sklearn is not just that it provides a whole bunch of algorithms, but also that from a software development point of view, it is so much cleaner to use than a lot of academic-based code. And one of the ways it really simplifies our life is that it uses a common interface for estimators, for models, and that's through the estimator class. So in this section, we're going to see how to initialize an estimator and then train a model. And you're going to see that it's surprisingly simple. So the first thing that we need to do is import. So this is a standard looking import where we're saying from this module, so from sklearn.linearModel, we want to import this function. So right now, linear regression just points to this function. When we have model is equal to linear regression with these parentheses, it calls the initializer and then returns the linear regression object. So what that means, don't worry about it. But if you want to start a model, you just need to make sure to call the class and then parentheses. Some models will require some arguments or some input parameters, but in this case, we don't need them. stored by default. They all have some default values. But right now our model, so we'll do Shift Enter to execute that. So right now our model is largely undefined. So it hasn't seen any data. So it doesn't know how many beta coefficients it should even store. So what we're going to do is generate some data for our model. First, we'll just get the X values. So this is the X1 and X2. And then what this does, it creates a 50 by 2 array. Now we're going to define some beta 1s and beta 2s. Feel free to modify that to whatever values you like. And then we're going to call the function that we just created. And this is deprecated, so we'll delete that. Now we do Shift Enter to run that again. Now we have created some data. So just to verify that it is as we expect, we'll run this, which is basically just looks at the length of Y label, so our output here, and then prints out the shape of our data. So here we have 50 samples as expected, and we have 2 features. So that's our X1 and X2. Now for the next part to fill out is, how do we fit the model? So models have the fit method, which you would call something like, oh, right up there. So sklearn uses the fit method for all its estimators. So here we just have to take our data and then plug it into this shape. Okay, so I'll just fill this in. Again, live coding, super dangerous. So we just have to do our data, so X data, and then Y label. And then we run this. And then it'll just ignore this. And that's basically it. We have fit our linear regression. But, you know, there's no output. We have nothing to see. That's not super interesting. So the beta values are stored in the coef property. So if we want to take a look at that, we take our model, access its properties using the dot operator, and then coef. So if we print this, you should see values which are closer to your beta 1s and beta 2s. So here, if we change this to 10 and then ran all this again, we'll see that our estimated coefficient changed from about 2 to about 10. Okay. So est is undefined. Okay, so there's a couple questions that are popping up. Once you get to this point, if you can get the model to, if you can get this line to run and then these numbers roughly match beta 1s and beta 2s, please raise your hand. Okay, so there's a couple questions here. Right, so that one is, oops. So is there a reason to isolate the random variable? No, that's just for ease of reading. What is the default algorithm .fit used to estimate coefs? So there is no default algorithm. It'll depend mostly on which model, and then each model is going to have its own implementation of fit. So for example, fitting a linear regression model is going to look very different than fitting a support vector machine. So if you want to look at what's actually implemented, you'd have to go to the documentation and read through that. what does it mean to fit a model? So in machine learning, we have our models, and the models are sets of parameters. Fitting a model is basically looking at our data, modifying our parameters so that our predictions are similar to the data that we've seen. So the idea is that we're trying to make some prediction and improving our model to make better predictions by showing it data. So if you're getting undefined errors, it's because you didn't run the previous cells. So make sure to select the cell and then Shift Enter to execute the cells. You should see a number appear here if it has been correctly executed. And then you should be able to get all the way to the bottom. Was one of those windows those are really close. That could just be a question of how much noise there was or not enough data. So that is just fine. Does it estimate two beta coefficients because there are two columns? So yes, so the number of parameters is determined by your data. And then if we want to estimate an intercept, so this is where understanding the model is super important, and doing everything by default is a little dangerous because there is actually an intercept which was automatically fitted. So whenever you're using any kind of model in sklearn or anything else, you want to make sure that you see what the model is actually doing. So, so the difference between X data and Y label. So here, if we look at the input and data, our input, so our X data, what that is a bunch of features. So if you're looking at height and weight of a person, those are your two features. If you're trying to predict something else based on those two features, that would be our Y label. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next section. Scroll. So the previous example was a little underwhelming. The data is really simple, and we already know that we have exactly the right model. So we're instead going to look at a much more, well, at a toy example, but one which is probably a bit more realistic. So sklearn has a whole bunch of very useful tools for prototyping toy examples, toy data sets, just in order to provide sanity checks to some of your early work. One of the ones that we can use is make regression, which, as you can probably guess from the name, produces data which are well suited for a regression problem. So one of the really nice things about Python is that it has a help function. So if we're not sure what a piece of code is supposed to be doing, we can just do help and then call the thing that we're not sure about. So the first thing we do is that we get make regression. And that's from sklearn.datasets, import make regression. Then if we just put that in help, we'll see the documentation show up. So just a side note for Jupyter, if you hover over the left side of this box, you'll see that it kind of lights up. You can click on that just to make it longer or shorter. That just helps in legibility and clutter. Then you can double click just to make it go away. So whenever you're trying to use a piece of code, make sure to go through the documentation, because one of the things that was told to me very early on for software development is that there's a whole bunch of pieces of software which will help you get answers, but they also help you get to the wrong answer very quickly. So if you're using a piece of code, make sure to go through at least the documentation to understand what it's supposed to be doing. So here, this just says, okay, this is the name of the function, and these are parameters you can define. So you can read through these if you like, but for our purposes, there's just a couple of these which are going to be important. So n samples does as you would expect. It produces an n number of samples in your data set. N features is how many columns or how many betas are we're going to use to produce our data. And then there's n informative, coef, and noise. So of particular interest is n informative. And that's because in typical machine learning problems, we're going to have a lot more features than are going to be useful. So for example, if you're looking at an MRI image and then you've got what is there, and you're trying to detect evidence of stroke, for example. I need to stop double clicking. You're trying to find evidence of stroke, then you're going to have a whole bunch of like different features, such as was their speech impaired? Are they having motor problems? But if one of those features you have is, do they like rock music? Do they prefer pop? Do they like metal? That feature is not really going to inform whether or not they had a stroke. So if you specify an informative, it's going to take a subset of the features to actually generate your data. So here, this is an example of how we would call this. So double clicking is such a habit for me. So coef here, this just tells you, this just tells the function to return the coefficients. We're going to use that to examine. And then noise is the variance, the random variable that we're going to add. So as we saw before, y labels is equal to sum beta x plus some random. This here is a random, this here is a call to make regression. And then you can feel free to change these features as you like. Now, if we execute this cell, so shift enter, see our x data shape. So we specified that we wanted 100 samples. So we have 100 samples in the first dimension. And then n features. And so we see that we have 5 features in our data. The third thing that we specified was n informative is equal to 3. Now, if we look at the coefficient values, we can see that that's reflected in the non-zero coefficients. So our y labels were generated using 46 multiplied by our first parameter plus 0 of the second feature plus 75 times the third and so on. All right, so this will be the third part that you need to fill in.
Can I pause it for just a quick second, Larry?
Yeah, sure.
I think some people only recently got their Jupyter Notebook open, and they've missed at the very beginning when you made the create data function. Could you just paste that in the Slack or something? Somebody pasted it in the chat, but I tried it and it wasn't working, and maybe I didn't parse it right.
Okay, so if you look at, when you did the git clone earlier, you got a whole bunch of files, one of which was section 1 IPy notebook, and that's the one that we have open. If you look, there's also a separate solutions. And this part has everything filled out. So if you missed the first part, you can just copy paste from this notebook into the first one.
Awesome, thanks.
But yeah, so I've got like 15 different windows open. So For all the panelists, please feel free to interrupt if there's like something happening that I'm not noticing. Okay, so for this area, we want to initialize the model and then store it under MDL. After that, we want to fit the model to our data, and then we want to print the coefficients. So I'll give you guys a minute to go through this section. And in the meantime, I'll take a look at the questions. See if that was answered live. So if this question here from earlier, if we fit the model MDL again, does it keep training? Does it keep the training it had before, or does it reset? So the way that we defined it is that we always initialized it and then trained it. So if you were just going to keep training it, that'll depend on the model, I think. I'm not entirely sure. So what's the point of having both end features and end informative? We can specify directly end features as the number of informative features, right? So those two play different roles. So if you have end informative is equal to end features, then it doesn't make a difference. The idea is that you want to have some of your coefficients be zero. So you want uninformative features. Could you please explain end info? Okay, so this is a sticking point. So earlier we had just two beta values, where each one determines something. So if we go back to the earlier section here we had beta 1 is equal to 10 or 5 or whatever else. And then the second one is equal to beta 2. The beta 2 was equal to 1. So if we had 0 here instead, let's start from the beginning. So our model is still trying to fit something, but the second column in our data doesn't actually modify our Y label. So our second column we can basically ignore, but we don't know that going in. Where was I? Nope. Okay, we're up here. Is it a problem if model.coef prints out integers and not floats? So what you're probably seeing is something like 2 dot, or I guess in this case, like 46 dot something. That should only really be happening if you have basically no noise. So if you set your noise equal to 0, you'll see that you get very exact ones. But otherwise, it should definitely be printing out floats. All right, so I'm going to go get the answers. Just going to find the answers. This right? Yes. All right, so so this was basically just use the fit that we'd had earlier, the same fit as we had earlier, which is X data, Y label, and then we just print out the coefficients. And then we run into the very classic out of order execution. So here we see that we have our 5 values. So the coefficients that were generating the function, our labels, was 0, 0, 25, 72, so on. So if we look at the models, at the coefficients that our model are converged to, is 1 times 10 to the negative 1, so 0.1. Here's negative 0.07. So these two values are very close to 0. Then here we have 25, which is really close, and we see that all these values are actually pretty good.
Lex, someone's
Yep.
just asking to clarify. I think they're asking, are the coefficients the model weights?
Yes.
Okay.
And then the second one, is it necessary to write MDL is equal to linear regression? Yes, it is. Oh, so here we had it previously defined. Here we're just trying to make sure that we're not accidentally reusing something from previous. So Jupyter Notebook is great, but it has this big problem, which is called out of order execution. So you can execute the cell below something before you execute this one. So you'll see a lot of things which are not strictly necessary. So for example, I don't need to re-import linear regression. It's more as a protection against that a little bit. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is visualize some of our predictions. So all models have this .predict method. So we're not just interested in, oh, well, can we get the coefficients? We also want to see, well, what does our prediction look like? So here there's just a bit of code to go get our predictions. So we feed in our data, we ask for the prediction, and then we plot our prediction versus our label. So if we run this, so this is what our model predicts should be the value. And then the y-axis is what the actual label is. So ideally, we want our prediction to be equal to label. So anything which is off the diagonal is slightly wrong. So we can see that this is actually, it looks good. This is basically just a diagonal line. So what happens when we vary the parameters of make regression and then fit the model again? Does the closeness of the parameter estimates, so the beta values, vary as you might expect? And what happens when you change n informative to 0? So I'll give you guys a minute or two to run through that. So you just have to scroll up, find where you defined make regression, and then vary some of these, and then see what the impact is on the model. So for example, if we say increase the noise by a factor of 10. So here we have something very similar. We still have 2 0 coefficients. And we'll run this again. And then we can see that our uninformative features have something which is not quite 0 as it was before. Oops. And then when we actually plot the results, we see not quite as neat a diagonal line as we would like. So before it was, you could basically just draw a very easy line through it. Here, there's a whole bunch of off diagonals. And then similarly, if you increase the number of samples by something ridiculous, even though there is a lot more noise, we see that our uninformative coefficients go back down to something closer to 0. Run this. And now everything's off diagonal, but UE can still fit a diagonal line through that just fine. Now the last thing is what happens when we set an informative to 0. So what happens if none of our features are informative? So 0. So we see, as we did before, except that all our coefficient values are 0. And when we fit this, well, they're all close to 0, but all the values are kind of comparable to each other. then when we actually plot this, well, there's nothing to fit here really. Okay, I'm going to pause a minute for questions/issues. How can we reach the bias? That comes up a little later. So if you look at the model property, so model dot, the bias is stored under intercept. So if you just print that value, you'll see the intercept go. Okay. Good. All right. So the next step, and this is probably one of the more important ones, is how do we know what a good model is? So we can see that the coefficients in the previous examples are close to their actual value, but that's only because we know exactly what generated our data. So we know what ground truth is. So realistically, that's not a situation that even can happen. So if we knew the ideal parameters of our model, we wouldn't need to estimate them. We would just use the ideal parameters. So more generally, we can never evaluate model parameters directly. So instead, what we can do is, instead of looking at the model directly, we can ask how our model's predictions line up against our labels. So instead of asking, is this a good model, we're changing the question to, how well do our predictions match our data? And this is one of many steps in abstracting a machine learning model. So our evaluation is now not concerned about the model itself directly, because we're not really sure if that question even means anything. And we're more concerned about how well we can estimate our data labels, or how well it can make predictions. So if we have some data of the form y equal f of x, so we have some data which we think can be generated using our input data. If we have some labels that we think can be generated using our input data, we're trying to find a function f, which is our model, that optimizes some evaluation metric. And the evaluation metric takes in just the prediction and the actual labels. So it doesn't really care what the model is. It doesn't look at the parameters directly. It just cares about how good is how good are your predictions. So every machine learning model requires some way to evaluate it. So the underlying learning algorithm for a model uses that evaluation metric in order to change the parameters to optimize predictions. So by definition, the optimal best values for parameters are not the ones which match some unknown ground truth. They are the ones that minimize the discrepancy between our true labels and our predicted labels. So I just said that every machine learning model requires an evaluation metric. And then we just trained a linear regressor, but we didn't define the evaluation metric. So in the example above, what was the evaluation metric? I'm curious to see if you guys have any guesses as to that. But we're kind of running short on time, so I'm just going to move through that. So linear regression tends to use the L2 loss, or the mean square error, in order to optimize itself. It's one of the few models which actually has a closed form solution. We're not going to talk about what that means. It's more to say that there is an evaluation metric, and then when you are saying, oh, this was best fitted, it doesn't make sense to make that statement without saying, this is the metric that we're using to define what is best. So here we're going to evaluate a model. So by evaluating, I don't mean that we're just going to look at the line and say, oh, it's diagonal, it's good enough. we want to be able to quantify the fit of a model. So as we did before, we're going to create data, initialize a model, except this time that we're going to create two subsets of data. So we're going to store the first 20 entries into X data 0 and Y label 0, and then we're going to store the remaining entries into X data 1 and Y label 1. So since there's some people that are not super familiar with Python, there's a quick reminder here about how to take subsets. It's basically just square brackets and then the index range. So in this next cell, we just import our linear regression. We make our regression data as we did before. Feel free to play around with the parameters. Random state is just that I could have something reproducible. You don't need to keep that if you don't want to. And the part I'd like you to fill in is splitting the X data variable, which we generated here, into X data 0 and X data 1. So we want to take the first 20 entries of X data and then put it into X data 0 and then the remaining into X data 1. I'll give you guys a minute to go through that. And then once you're able to run this cell and you've completed this section, raise your hand, please.
While we're waiting, just briefly, do you want to answer the question, does the model choose itself which features are informative or not among the 5 ones?
Why? Sorry, I don't see the question. Can you repeat it?
Does the model choose itself which features are informative or not among the 5 features?
Sort of. So choosing itself implies some selection, some external thing saying, okay, well, this one doesn't seem to be doing anything. It's more that if we look at the results, it just says, if I assign this value to that feature, I get better predictions. So it's not so much that it chooses, more that the values that it came up with are the ones that best predict the data that it's seen. And because I am a scaredy cat, I'm going to go copy and paste the solution I already have. Nope, that's lower. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways to do this. So if you don't have something which is exactly the same, that's fine. I think if you're relatively new to Python, you might have done X data 1 on a separate line. That is perfectly fine, and arguably it's probably even more legible. So arguably it could be better than this. So then if we execute this, it should run without error. Then at the very end, we're doing the print coef and print model coef. So coef here is the generating coefficients. Model.coef are the ones that we fitted. Then we can see the differences here. So you might end up with different numbers depending on your values here. So now that we're asking, since the point of this exercise is, are these good? Well, maybe. Just at a glance. Yeah.
Sorry, I think it would be good if you go and give us a brief overview of all the steps by now. I think some people are lagging behind. So if you just go over like just steps that you took to get here from the starting point, I guess.
So this section is kind of independent from the other ones. So like this cell is self-contained. So if people are having trouble catching up, you can just kind of skip over the previous ones and then just come directly down to example estimator evaluation 1.
And if anyone's finding their notebooks not working, again, go to the one in the solutions folder, because then it'll all work.
Yeah. Could you give an okay, yeah, so there's a question here. Could you give an example? N samples as each participant, each feature would be a measured variable. Yes, that is exactly right. So you have a sample would correspond to a subject, and then feature would be height, weight, music preference, and those types of things. All right, so here, if you get your coefficients and model coefficients, you're going to see a whole bunch of numbers. You can compare them, but we're still asking the question, what is, how well is our model doing? So sklearn has a whole bunch of different metrics for evaluating models. You can see them under sklearn.metrics. There's also a list and a whole bunch of other information on the documentation page. So if we look at this, we see a whole bunch of information along with a list of different metrics. We're not going to look at all the different ones. Just know that they are there. So the ones that, one which is very useful for predicting, for assessing regression tasks is the R2 score, or coefficient of determination. I'm not a statistician. I don't know the names. But you can get it readily through sklearn.metrics.r2 score. So we're going to get our score using this function. So to do so, we're going to need the data labels along with the model predictions. So okay, I'm just going to import this from the other one. So this section is relatively short. So we just want to import the metrics. Then we want to get our model predictions. So that's just mdl.predict. And then we're going to use our xdata0. And then finally, we're going to use that prediction along with our labels to get the R2 score. I'm just going to delete the white space. Then we run this, we're going to end up with some number. So here we have an R2 score of 86, which corresponds to 86% of the variance has been explained by our model. Now, if we just wanted to evaluate something else, if we want to use another metrics, that's relatively easy. Instead of R2 score, we could pick mean squared error and run that instead. The R2 score is a lot more intuitive, but for a number of different reasons, you may want to be looking at MSE. But then the question is, how is our model performing well? So we've got some error, some R2 score here, but what does performing well mean? So in the previous section, I'd ask you, I pointed out that in order to evaluate anything, we need to have some way to quantify it. More philosophically, I guess, we want to be asking, what does it mean for a model to perform well in the first place? So here, if instead we use our second subset of data, so we generated xdata0 and then xdata1. What if instead of xdata0, we tried to evaluate our model on data it hadn't seen before, so xdata1? So we'll see here that the R2 score is significantly lower than the previous one. So previously we'd gotten 86% of variance explained. Here we're getting at 58. So we already know that our data was generated using the same distribution. So why does it perform so poorly? So if we put aside quantitative metrics for a second, can we build do we have an intuitive understanding of what does it mean when we ask whether a model performs well? And forgive me for waxing poetic for a second. The answer is kind of similar to the question of how do we know we can trust a scientific result? And the answer for that is scientific findings don't exist in a vacuum. So scientific hypotheses turn into theories when they make predictions that can be independently reproduced. So if one lab finds that, oh, well, thoughts are generated in the kidneys and they have a whole bunch of data to back that up, then, okay, that's fine, but another lab's not going to be able to reproduce that. So if we look at the example above, what did we actually do? So we created some data, we fitted our model to that data, and then we evaluated on that data. And that's a little problematic because by definition, machine learning models optimize their performance based on data they have seen. So instead of evaluating on data that we've seen, we split our data into the training set and then a test set. The training set is used to inform our model parameters and then optimize our models. The test set is used to predict how well it's going to perform on new unseen data. That split is very important, and I think Yarkoni in the previous talk mentioned it 20 different times. And the reason for that is critical to evaluating any kind of model. So handling your data sets becomes extremely important. So as we saw in the previous section, we just divided it into two sets. So without knowing what the names were, we had that division. So here we have our training and then testing sets. So the training set is whatever goes into the fit method of a model. The test set is what we use to evaluate using scoring across either scoring or other evaluation metrics. So here we're going to do something similar as we did before and just generate new data. So, and then we're going to split it using sklearn's train test split. So if you're not sure how to use this, we can use the help function. And basically it just takes in a bunch of arrays followed by test size or train size. All right, so okay, so in this other example, what we're going to do is generate a new data set that allows us to visualize it. So previously we'd had 5 features, which plots very poorly. I can't plot 5 dimensions without making things a lot more complicated. And even then, it's not super informative. So we're going to limit ourselves to 2 dimensions, one for the output, one for the input. So a simple example is if you have y is equal to a times x followed by b times x squared. You only have the x on the input side and then only the y on the output side. Then we'll want to plot our data using matplotlib. Then we're going to split our data, and then we're going to plot the 2 sets. So here we have our x data and y label. The matplotlib import is almost muscle memory because this is basically the most common module within matplotlib that you're going to use. And then to plot our data, we can just use plt.plot and then x data y label, and then shift enter to execute that. Now you're probably going to see a mess of a whole bunch of lines, and that's not very helpful. So you can specify how how the plot should be displayed using a string. So here, if you just put period in between quotes, it'll generate a nice point plot. All right. So in the next cell, we just want to import the train test split. So from sklearn dot, where's it from? I think it's in the model selection. Import train test split. And then we're going to split our X data into X train and X test. So train test split X data Y label. And then we're going to specify we want 0.6 or 60% of our data to be in our training set. Then we're just going to plot the shape of it for sanity. So here we have 60 samples in our training set, which is what we want. Right, and then here you just need to execute the cell, and it's going to plot our data using different colors. So the blue is for our training set, the red is for our test set. And you can see that it's kind of spread out and overlapping, and that's what we want. We want our training set to resemble our test set as much as possible without actually having the same samples. So one of the things that we'd like to do is initialize that we'd like to fit and then see what our model is actually predicting and how it's actually producing a line. So here we're going to do the same thing as we did before. We import our model, we initialize it, we fit it, and then we're going to take a look at the fit coefficients and intercept. If you execute this.
Just quickly, someone's asking, does this function split the data set randomly?
I'm not entirely sure. Pretty sure it does.
I'll check it out in the documentation.
Yeah, so one of the really nice things about, if ever you're not sure about what a function is actually doing, you can always just go to the help, and if we execute this cell, I'm like 80% sure that it does. So it splits arrays or matrices into random train and test subsets. So yes. So as long as you don't define the random state, it'll produce random subsplits or random subsets. All right, so one of the things which is pretty useful for models is most estimators will have an implementation of the dot score. So previously we went to metrics and then got the R2 score and then returned that. Model.score will return some default score, which tends to be best suited for that model. So here what this does is that this section will just plot the best fit line on the training data. Then we can print the model score using print model.score x train y train, and we execute this cell. So the dots are our training data. The black line is the best fit line. And then we can do something identical for our test set. Then here we see that the score for our training score is pretty similar to our test score. And then depending on the values that you actually use to generate the data and then split it and so on, you'll see the fit behave a little differently. So if we went back and then reinitialized the data using a bunch of different values, we're going to see that this changes, and the effect of those parameters on both the training and the testing score. So the previous exercise was good at demonstrating the effect of differently sized splits of data. But one of the most common problems in machine learning is overfitting. So when we have a model which is way too complex for the amount of data that we have. So overfitting is, so the definition of overfitting is when you have a model which is optimized for the training set to the detriment of the performance on a test set. So if you're doing extremely well on the training set, but then extremely poorly on the test set, chances are you have overfit your model. And part of the cause of that is too little data. The other cause is too much complexity. And those are kind of the same problem. If you have a lot of data, you can have much more complex models without having to worry about overfitting. And similarly, if you have very simple models, you don't need much data. So in this example, we're going to do something very similar to previous. Instead of random lines, random regression problems, we're just going to generate a simple parabola at random points. We're going to plot that data just so we can see what it looks like. And then we're going to use a function called polynomial features to create powers of our random samples. So one of the things that's pretty common in neuroscience is to use age and age squared. And that improves performance. But what does that actually mean? It just means that you're using, that you're augmenting your feature space using polynomials. So you can have h squared, h cubed, h, and all of those are kind of going to improve your performance, your prediction performance. So after we use the polynomial features to create powers, we're going to fit a whole bunch of them from 0 to 20, then plot the fitted model performance, and then plot the predictions versus the features, and then labels versus features on the same plot. So this section is asking quite a lot. Most of it has been filled out. So you just need to execute the cells, and then you can play around with the values that are in here. I'll just walk you through the code really quickly. So X data is just generating 200 data samples. Y label, that's our target. Then we have x minus 0.2 times x minus 0.6, and that's going to create a parabola. And then we have some random noise added in. Then we split our data as we should always do. And then we just create a point plot. And then you can see that there are zeros at 0.2 and 0.6. Well, C is a bit generous, but you can kind of squint and see that the zeros are here. So we have some parabola which looks like this. So in the general sense, we don't usually know what the function mapping X to Y is going to look like. So we made some assumptions early on that, okay, well, it's going to be some weighted sum of the features. And that's fine to some extent. But generally, you don't really know that going in. So one of the ways that you can increase your performance is to use augmentation, where in this case, we're just taking a whole bunch of different polynomial powers, a whole bunch of powers of our features. And because sklearn is fantastic and has a whole bunch of features, it already has this implemented. So this is an example of how you would use it. So we just import it, we define some example data, we create our object here, and then we do fit transform. And then if you plot this, we have degree 0 of our data, which is just a flat line, degree 1, which is a simple ax plus b, and then parabola here. And then for our actual data, here we're going to create polynomials of our features. So previously we defined xtrain as our data. So we're going to run that, and then we're going to fit the model, and then print the score. So here we're able to explain 84% of the variance, which is not bad. But again, this is on the training set, so it's not bad, but it's kind of meaningless. Then we can also return the test score, and we see that that is significantly lower. Now, if we do this for all polynomials of degrees 0 to 20, we can see how the model performance changes with model complexity. We just run this, nothing gets plotted, but we do have our testing and our training score in these two lists. And then we plot those results, and then we should see two curves that look something like this. So blue is the training score. So that is the score that we expect to do well on. And then the test score is the one which we're using to generalize our predictions. So here we see that there's a sharp increase when you go from 0 to 2. So here, when you're just using a straight constant, we're doing not very well. Then when you include a line, we're doing a little better. And then when you when you get to the right model, which is a parabola, you kind of hit the peak, and increasing degrees doesn't really do much and arguably makes it a little worse. And we can visualize why we would think that, well, why it actually becomes worse by looking at what the predicted curve would be. So here we just take a whole bunch of samples and then make those predictions. And then we see that this is the polynomial that it expects, that it thinks would fit the data if we're at degree 20. And you can look at this and say, well, yeah, okay, I mean, I guess it fits, but this doesn't look super realistic. Now, what happens if we increase this from the degree of the polynomial is from 20 to 30? Well, we just modify this value and then rerun it again. And we see that it's getting gradually worse. And then our actual predicted curve looks crazier and crazier. And then we can just keep increasing this, and we see that it just gets worse and worse. Now, depending on the actual data that you used, you're going to see either some very sharp drop-off over here. Fortunately, I didn't get lucky with the data that we have here. But you can see that as you get lower, you get a lot more variation from degree to degree, and then some drop-offs.
Lex?
Yeah.
Could you go over one more time what polynomial features does exactly, and what do you mean by degree?
Right, so the polynomial features, what this does is it creates powers of the data that you put into it. So for example, if you have age as one of your features, you put it into polynomial features with degree 2. And then what that's going to return is age to the power of 0, age to the power of 1, age to the power of 2. And then similarly, if you were to increase this all the way to degrees equal to 10, you'd have age to the power of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. So you can get some very complex functions of age using polynomial features. So here in this example, we're using just a very simple range, which just goes from 0 to 10. And then we're taking polynomial features of that. So when we have a very simple line, which is going from 0 to 10, and you take the power of 0 of that, it just goes to constant 1. Take power of 1, that's just the data again. So you can see it increases from 0 down here to 10. And then if we take, or 9 technically, then if we take power 2, it goes from 0 to 81. So down here, when we're taking, when we're putting in 50 here, we're feeding in degrees equal to 50. So we're saying take all powers of age from age to the power of 0 to age to the power of 50. And then when we actually predict that, well, this curve is basically a degree 50 polynomial, which looks a little wonky. And if your data doesn't actually support that, then you're just going to end up with some weird curves. So if we kept this up to 50, but then drastically increase the amount of data that we have, so the amount of data is up here. So if instead of fitting 200, we had 2000, well, you can see that this curve immediately becomes much denser. This won't change. And then our model score for the training data is 77. And when we compare that to the testing data, it's a lot more comparable than what we had before with much less data. Now we can run the degree 50. Hopefully this doesn't break. Okay, so this is the part that I was saying was a little wonky. So depending on the actual data that you have, you can get some extremely bad scores. And the reason for that, it just fits super poorly. And then if you look at the degree 50 polynomial, you can tell, yeah, okay, it fits. It runs through a whole bunch of this data, but it'd be a lot simpler if it just used a degree 2 instead of a degree 50. Okay, so that's it for day 1. We're going to stay online for questions if you have any. There are exercises that I think are going to be good practice for you guys if you do them in the afternoon. So if you look at the MLCN directory that you guys cloned from GitHub, you'll see day 1 exercises. Then if we open that up, you'll see instructions of what to implement. So a lot of these are, so part of this is programming with Python experience. Some of this is sklearn experience. So if you guys have, if you were able to go through the material that was presented today, you should be able to implement the things that are listed here. There are links to the documentation. So we didn't look at support vector regression or decision tree regression, but you can click on the links and then see how to use them. So in the very simple case, you don't really need to know much about what the model is doing in the background, but the information is there if you want to go find it. Other than that, were there any questions from the?
I just wanted to say I noticed a few questions from people like not understanding what particular variables were or particular functions.
Sure.
So one thing that's helpful is what Lex shows, just typing help and then in brackets the name of the function. But also if you go to the sklearn documentation or nylearn or whatever you're using, it has the same stuff as would be output by typing help, but also they have some examples. And I find if I look at the examples first, usually I get kind of an intuition for what the function is doing. And then if I read the actual text, it makes more sense.
So one of the really great things about scikit-learn is that this is basically a textbook. So if you go to the user guide, there's a whole bunch of information. So here we have information on linear models. And this is good if you want to see what the mathematics are and how it's implemented and how to use them. But some of the things I think are useful to know, but are not necessary. But at the very least, if you go through some of the examples that are posted there, or if you just went through the material that was presented in the morning at your own pace, that's probably going to be useful. So do we start the practical exercises after lunch break? So the practical exercises, those are offline. We are available to help you out with them if you run into any problems, or if you want some help getting it, if you want any help working through it. But they're not going to be on Zoom or anything else. Follow-up question. Using polynomial features equivalent to using polynomial model instead of linear regression. Yeah. I mean, depending on what you mean by polynomial model is basically just a linear regression, but with powers of features. So yes. Could you clarify what score in the model.score was? So that was one of the sneaky things I was going to surprise you guys with tomorrow. But so the model.score is, it varies according to model. So in the case of linear regression, it's the R2 score. For other classifiers, the R2 score doesn't really make much sense. So for example, if you're looking at classification problems, when you're just trying to say, is the patient sick, is the patient not sick? R2 doesn't really make sense. So there they'll have their own separate metric, which is what is returned by model.score. Okay. So I think that was it for questions.
Someone in the chat was asking if anyone wanted to try the exercises together in a breakout room. I think if you wanted to do something like that, you should post in the Slack, because.
Oh yeah. So if you guys do want to work together, we do encourage that. So if you want to organize groups, that is fantastic. That is a type of participation that we kind of love seeing. So if there's anything that we can do to help facilitate that, feel free to ping me directly, Lex, on Slack, and then I'll help you set that up if I can. Probably the simplest way is just to post in general chat and then see what people are willing to do together. Polynomial features, great powers of features, so basically square and so on are features. That is correct. So degree 2 squares it, degree 3 will cube it, and so on. So that helps increase that helps fit functions which are more complex than just linear sums. So just in case people forgot, if you go through, no, where did I put it? This is why using shortcuts and terminals are. All right, so if you're in the MLCN, no, that is not the one you're going to see. Right, so if you want to go through the section 1 notebook on your own, you run into any issues, the solutions are available in the separate solutions directory. And if there are no more questions, I'll shut down all the things. I
think Karadak had a follow-up question. You mean instead of using linear functions, we may use more complex models?
So linear regression is still linear even if it fits powers of the features. So the nonlinear part is the things that you're applying to your features. So if you were to take age and then age squared, you're still doing linear regression. You could I'll use other functions such as age squared, and then sine of age, for example. That probably doesn't really mean anything, but that is something you can do.
Do you think maybe the confusion is like with whether you're doing a straight line or like a curvy line, which is a polynomial? In the case you're talking about, your
so the powers, so the additional powers lets you fit data which is not just linear. So if you have something which is not linear in one of your input features, if you have just the input features, you're never going to be able to fit that properly. So if you have like some parabola and then you try to fit a line through it, you're going to get something, but it's not ideal. Whereas if you just took that same feature and then took the square of it, you're going to fit that parabola much more closely. If we can see that the polynomial features beyond second degree are worsening the fit, what would the next step be? How do we specify the best model then? We're going to cover that tomorrow. It's basically the answer is cross-validation. And unfortunately, the answer in basically all machine learning is cross-validation. So that's not super helpful, but we're going to see that tomorrow. Is logistic regression also linear? It's linear in log space. This is where my math fails me.
Yes, it is actually.
Yeah. Where's logistic? So the issue here is that so we're going to see this tomorrow again, but logistic regression is not regression despite its name. So it is a classifier instead of a regressor. We're going to see what that means tomorrow.